He called her that African woman in front of 30 people, his own wife, 7 months pregnant, standing at the head of his family's dinner table. Not her name, not his wife, that African woman. Zuri Okafor Kong didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She set down her chopsticks with the kind of careful, deliberate calm that only comes from a person who has finally decided something. And everyone at that table, every cousin, every underboss, every silk-suited member of the Kong dynasty, watched her reach up, unclasp the thin gold chain at her throat, and say nothing. That night, she left her wedding ring on the nightstand and walked out before dawn. And the most feared mafia boss in Seoul came home to an empty bed and a ring that accused him of everything he'd refused to see. If that were you, would you have stayed? Before we go further, if this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because the stories only get more intense from here. Now let's go back to where it all began to break. The first time Zuri Okafor walked into a room full of Kang Do-hyun's associates, she wore a plain navy blazer, carried a leather legal portfolio, and spoke Korean with a slight Atlanta inflection that made two of his lieutenants exchange a glance they thought she didn't catch. She caught it. She'd been catching glances like that since she landed in Seoul 3 years earlier on an international law fellowship that was supposed to last 18 months. She'd stayed because the work was real, the cases were complex, and somewhere along the way the city had gotten into her blood. The 2 a.m. street food stalls, the Han River at dusk, the particular way Koreans said her name, giving the syllables a shape they didn't quite have back home. She had not stayed for Kang Do-hyun. That part came later, and she hadn't seen it coming. Their first meeting wasn't romantic. It was a legal consultation. One of Do-hyun's legitimate holding companies, and he had enough of them to make the criminal side of his empire nearly invisible to anyone not specifically looking, was tangled in an international arbitration dispute involving a Singapore-based logistics firm. His in-house legal team had hit a wall. Someone recommended Zuri. Do-hyun agreed to one meeting. He was 20 minutes late. He walked in without apologizing, sat across from her and said, "Tell me what my team is missing." She told him. For 45 minutes, without notes, she laid out the 3 procedural errors his team had made in the initial filing, the 2 evidentiary issues they hadn't flagged, and the specific treaty provision the Singapore firm was going to use to gut their position in arbitration. She did it in clean, direct Korean, and when she finished, she folded her hands on the table and waited. He looked at her for a long moment. "How long have you been in Korea?" "Long enough," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. She won the arbitration. He called her 6 weeks later with another case. Then another. By the 4th case, they were meeting for dinner to debrief, and Zuri was telling herself it was professional, just professional, even as she started picking restaurants she thought he might like, and then hating herself a little for it. Do-hyun, for his part, moved with the directness of a man who had never once second-guessed a major decision in his life. He decided he wanted Zuri in his life the same way he decided anything, by recognizing it as fact and then moving toward it without ceremony. He asked her to dinner that wasn't a debrief on a Tuesday night in March, and when she looked at him across the table and said, "You know what you are, right?" He said, "Yes." "Is that a problem?" And she'd said, "I haven't decided yet." She decided. Against every sensible instinct she had, she decided. The early months were not uncomplicated. There were looks in restaurants. There were members of his organization who went cold and formal whenever she walked into a room. There was the particular silence of Do-hyun's mother, Madame Kang, the first time Zuri attended a family dinner, a silence so specifically pointed that it functioned exactly like a sentence. But Do-hyun was present then. That was the difference. In those early months, he was there. He noticed the silences. He placed his hand on the small of her back when his mother aimed one of her carefully worded observations at Zuri's background, her age, her foreignness. He didn't make speeches about it. He just moved closer, and his mother understood what that meant, and for a while it held. They married in a small ceremony, small by Kong standards, which still meant 90 people in a venue that cost more than Zuri's parents' house. She wore a dress she'd found in Insadong with Naomi, her closest friend in Seoul, a Black American woman from Chicago who'd come to Korea on a teaching contract and never quite left. Naomi had cried. Do-hyun had not, but he'd held Zuri's hand through the entire reception with a grip that told her he meant every word of the vow. She believed him. The belief started eroding slowly, the way the bank of a river erodes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but grain by grain, over seasons, until one day you look and there's almost nothing left. The first year was fine. The second year, Do-hyun's empire hit turbulence. A rival syndicate from Busan began pushing into Seoul territory. 3 of his senior lieutenants were arrested in a corruption sweep that came uncomfortably close to his own name. 2 of his legitimate businesses came under audit simultaneously, which was not a coincidence, and everyone involved knew it. He started working through the night. He started taking calls during meals. He stopped taking calls from Zuri when he was in meetings, and the meetings got longer. And eventually she stopped calling during them because she already knew he wouldn't answer, and she was tired of watching the phone ring out. She told herself he was under pressure. She told herself this was temporary. She was a smart woman. She knew exactly what she was telling herself and exactly why. Madame Kang filled the vacuum Do-hyun left behind. She began with subtlety. A comment about Zuri's Korean pronunciation at a family lunch. A suggestion that perhaps Zuri should learn to prepare certain traditional dishes if she wanted to be taken seriously as a Kang wife. A story told to a cousin within Zuri's earshot about a friend's son who had married a foreign woman and the complications that arose. Always deniable, always just barely within the range of something Zuri could conceivably be accused of misreading if she said anything about it. Zuri said nothing. She smiled. She kept her posture straight and her voice level because she had grown up in Atlanta as the daughter of a Nigerian father and an African-American mother who had both taught her that dignity was something you wore, not something you explained to people who had already decided not to see it. But it accumulated. Every comment, every cold look, every story told to her face about why she didn't quite belong, it all went somewhere, even when she didn't show it. It went into the space that Do-hyun's absences had opened up. It settled there. When Zuri discovered she was pregnant, she sat in Naomi's bathroom for 20 minutes before she told her. Not because she wasn't glad. She was, beneath the fear, genuinely glad. She sat there because she was doing the math. She was 7 weeks along. Do-hyun had been in Busan for 5 of the last 8 weeks. They'd had dinner together, a real dinner, twice in the last month. She was trying to remember the last time he'd asked her how she was sleeping, and she couldn't. She told him that night, over the phone, because he was in another meeting and she'd learned to say important things in the gaps between meetings, or not at all. There was a silence after she told him. Not a cold silence. She could hear him shifting, could hear the catch in his breath. "Are you, Zuri, are you okay?" "I'm okay," she said. "Are you?" Yes, I'm coming home." He came home. They sat at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night, and he held her hands and she watched his face move through something complicated and real. And for a brief, clear moment she thought, this is it. This is the thing that pulls him back. She thought the baby would change the geometry of everything. For about 3 weeks, it seemed like it might. He came home earlier. He sat with her. He put his hand on her still flat stomach with a kind of stunned reverence that made her eyes sting. He told his mother about the pregnancy in person, and Madame Kang received the news with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Let's hope the child takes after its father." And Do-hyun said nothing. He said nothing. He squeezed Zuri's hand under the table, which she supposed was meant to mean something, but later that night she sat in their bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror and thought about what it meant that the most powerful man she had ever known couldn't manage 3 words to his own mother. She didn't say this to him. She was so used to not saying things by then. The 3 weeks passed. The Busan situation escalated again. The meetings came back. The phone calls that interrupted dinner came back. The nights when he didn't come home until she was already asleep came back. She was 4 months along, then 5, and her body was changing and she was exhausted in a way that was physical and also something else, something that didn't have a clean medical name. And she lay in their enormous bed in the Kang family penthouse and stared at the ceiling and felt the specific loneliness of being technically not alone. She tried. She left notes. She asked him, directly, twice, if they could schedule actual time. Not a meeting, not a dinner that might get canceled, just an agreement that on certain evenings he would be there. He agreed both times. He made it once. She stopped asking. The dinner happened on a Saturday in November. Madame Kang hosted at the family compound, a gathering of 30 people, senior family members, and associated business partners. The kind of event where Zuri had learned to sit very straight and speak very precisely and give the room nothing to use against her. She was 7 months along. Her feet ached. She had dressed carefully in a dark green dress that her friend Naomi had helped her choose, and she looked by any reasonable measure composed and beautiful and exactly like what she was, the wife of the man who sat at the head of this table. Madame Kang had arranged the seating. Zuri was placed 3 seats down from Do-hyun, between 2 cousins who talked across her for most of the first course. That was ordinary enough. She ate her soup. She smiled at the appropriate moments. She monitored Do-hyun from 3 seats away and watched him field quiet conversations about business she wasn't supposed to know the details of. And she thought, not for the first time, I am a guest at my own family dinner. Then Madame Kang began to speak. It started as a story about a charitable foundation Madame Kang had recently endowed, a cultural preservation initiative. The importance of maintaining Korean heritage, Korean traditions, the Kang family name and its obligations. She spoke with the particular warmth of a woman who knew exactly how to make a general statement function as a personal one. Zuri watched her. She had learned to read Madame Kang the way you learn to read weather, not by what was said, but by where the pressure was building. Of course, Madame Kang said, her voice carrying the light, pleasant tone of someone commenting on the weather. The most difficult challenge in these matters is when outsiders attempt to claim belonging they haven't earned. She paused. Her eyes moved briefly to Zuri. Some roots simply don't translate. The table went quiet in that specific way. Not silent, but quieter, conversations dropping just slightly in volume as people tuned in without appearing to. Zuri set down her chopsticks. She did it with complete control. Both hands on the table, spine straight. She looked at Madame Kang and waited for Do-hyun to say something. He was looking at his plate. Do-hyun, his mother said, smoothly continuing, has always understood the weight of what he carries. The legacy of this family is not something that can be diluted by... She gestured, a small fluid movement in Zuri's general direction. Outside influences. Don't you agree? 30 people. 30 people, and not one of them looked at Zuri directly, which was somehow worse than if they had. Do-hyun looked up from his plate. He looked at his mother. He looked at Zuri. He said, Mother, let's not... She means well, one of the cousins murmured, not to anyone in particular. And then Madame Kang smiled at the table and said, clearly, pleasantly, with the confidence of a woman who had never once been contradicted in her own home. That African woman has never understood what she married into. I've always said so. That African woman. Not her daughter-in-law, not Zuri, not even her name. That African woman, spoken in front of her face, in front of 30 people, at 7 months pregnant, in the home that was supposed to be her family's. Zuri stood up. Her chair scraped back. She picked up her purse. She looked at Do-hyun one more time, one long, searching look. And what she saw in his face was not rage, not defense, not the man who had held her hands at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night and said, I'm coming home. What she saw was a man doing the precise calculation of what it would cost him to make a scene at his mother's table. She walked out of the dining room. She walked through the compound. She walked to the car, told the driver to take her home, and rode the entire way in silence with her hands folded in her lap and her face perfectly still. Back at the penthouse, she moved quietly. She was methodical about it. She took her toothbrush, her prenatal vitamins, the photograph of her parents that she kept on the nightstand, the legal files she'd been working on at home, a week's worth of clothes. She put them in 2 bags. She called Naomi, who answered on the second ring and asked no questions, just said, I'll be awake, and that was enough. Before she left, she stood at the nightstand. She reached up and unclasped her earrings. She set them in the small ceramic dish where she kept them. Then she looked at her wedding ring for a long moment. She pulled it off, set it in the center of the nightstand, where he would see it the instant he came through the door. She picked up her bags and walked out before the city had finished deciding whether it was still night or already morning. Do-hyun came home at 4:47 a.m. He came through the bedroom door still loosening his tie, moving quietly the way he always did when he came home late and thought she was sleeping. He reached the nightstand to put down his phone. He saw the ring. He stood very still. He picked it up, held it in his palm, looked at the empty side of the bed, her pillow undisturbed, the covers unturned, the lamp still on because she'd left it on so he wouldn't come home to a completely dark room. And somehow that detail, that small consideration, even in the act of leaving, hit him somewhere his body wasn't prepared for. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He sat there for a long time, the ring in his hand, not moving. Outside the window, Seoul went on doing what Seoul does, bright and relentless and indifferent, 30 floors below a man who had spent 15 years building a world where he controlled every variable, every outcome, every room he walked into, and who was only now beginning to understand what it costs to confuse control with presence. The ring was cold in his palm. The room was very quiet. He sat on the edge of that bed until the sky outside turned gray. Not thinking, not planning, just sitting there with a wedding ring in his palm and the specific silence of a room where someone used to be. Kang Do-hyun was not a man who sat. His entire adult life had been built on movement, on decision, on action, on the particular velocity that kept a criminal empire functional and its enemies uncertain. Stillness was something he allowed other people. It was a luxury, like sentiment, like doubt. He'd trained himself out of all three by the time he was 26. But he sat there until 6 in the morning, and the ring didn't get warmer, and the bed stayed empty, and eventually the housekeeper arrived and saw the light under the bedroom door and knocked softly. And he said, "Don't come in." And she didn't. At 6:15 he called Zuri. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and her voice on the recording said her name and her callback number in Korean and then in English. And something about hearing her English hit him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He hung up without leaving a message. He called again at 6:40. Voicemail. At 7 he sent a text. "Where are you? Are you okay?" 3 hours later she replied, "I'm safe. Don't send anyone." He read that twice. Don't send anyone. She knew him. She knew exactly the first move he would make, which was to dispatch someone to locate her and confirm she was secure, because that was how he handled problems. By gathering information, by putting eyes on a situation, by converting the unknown into something he could assess and manage. She had preemptively told him not to, which meant she understood that she was not a problem to be managed, and she needed him to understand that too. He put the phone down on the nightstand, next to the small ceramic dish where she kept her earrings. The dish was still there. The earrings were gone. He showered. He put on a suit. He went to his office in the penthouse tower 3 blocks from the family compound, and he sat behind his desk, and his chief of staff, Park Junho, came in at 8:30 with a briefing on the Busan situation, and Do-hyun listened to approximately 4 minutes of it before he said, "Get out." Junho got out. Do-hyun sat alone in his office and looked at the city and thought about the specific moment at dinner, when his mother had said those words, and he had looked at his plate. He had looked at his plate. He told himself, in the half second it took his brain to process what his mother had said, that making a scene would embarrass Zuri further, that the best move was to address it privately, later, calmly, without the audience. He told himself this with the same efficient certainty he applied to everything, and in doing so he had left his pregnant wife to absorb a public humiliation alone while he calculated the social geometry of intervening. She'd walked out without a word, and he'd sat there and watched her go and resumed the dinner. He'd resumed the dinner. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and held them there. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. His mother. He let it ring. She called again 20 minutes later. He answered on the 5th ring because not answering would have required a conversation he wasn't ready to have with himself about why he was avoiding her. And Do-hyun had spent 15 years making sure he never had conversations with himself he wasn't ready for. "You left without saying goodbye," Madame Kang said. Her voice carried the precise blend of warmth and reproach she'd perfected over 63 years. "I came home," he said. Zuri was gone. A brief pause. "I see." "Do you?" "Do-hyun, she's always been—" "Don't." His voice came out flat. Not raised, not aggressive, just flat in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. "Don't say anything right now, not today. I am your mother. I was protecting this family's—" "I said don't." Silence. Then, "She's made you into someone I don't recognize. Maybe," he said, "you should think about what that means." And he hung up. He'd never hung up on his mother in his life. He sat there waiting for something. Guilt, maybe. or the familiar anxiety of having disrupted family order. But what came instead was a dull, exhausted clarity, like a window getting wiped clean and revealing a view you'd been looking through for years without actually seeing. He called Junho back in. "Find out where Naomi Brooks lives," he said. "Don't contact her. Don't approach the building. Just confirm the address and report back." Junho didn't blink. "Yes, sir." "And cancel my morning. The Busan Consortium is expecting—" "Cancel it." Junho left. Do-hyun picked up the wedding ring again from where he'd set it on his desk. He'd carried it in his jacket pocket from the bedroom without realizing he'd done it. He turned it between his fingers. It was a simple band. She'd chosen it herself, had refused the elaborate setting his jeweler had initially proposed. "I'm not a display piece," she'd said, not unkindly but firmly. And he'd thought at the time that he loved her for it. He still loved her for it. He just hadn't been showing it in any language she could read lately. Junho returned in 11 minutes with an address in Mapogu. An apartment building, mid-range, the kind of place that housed expats and graduate students and people who lived in Seoul without being of it. Do-hyun knew the neighborhood. He'd driven through it exactly once, years ago, on the way somewhere else. He did not go there. He wanted to. Every instinct he had said go there, appear in person, make the case. But he'd spent all morning slowly, painfully absorbing the fact that appearing in person and making cases was not what this situation needed. It needed something he was considerably less practiced at. He needed to wait. The waiting was physical. It lived in his chest, behind his sternum, a pressure that didn't ease when he moved or worked or stood at the window looking at the city he'd spent 15 years learning to dominate. He had men who owed him favors in the National Assembly. He had prosecutors who'd taken his calls for a decade. He had the kind of reach that made most problems, when viewed from a certain angle, solvable. His wife was in an apartment in Mapogu with her friend, 7 months pregnant, and there was nothing he could solve about that. Naomi's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building with a broken elevator, which meant Zuri had walked up 4 flights of stairs at 7 months pregnant with 2 bags, probably at 5 in the morning, and Naomi had opened the door and not asked questions. He knew Naomi by reputation. Zuri talked about her the way you talk about the one person who never makes you explain yourself. He was glad she had Naomi. He was also aware that Naomi almost certainly had opinions about him that had been forming for the better part of 2 years and sharpening considerably in the last 12 hours. He was right about that. Naomi Brooks had opinions about Kang Do-hyun the way a prosecutor has opinions about a defendant, built from evidence, organized by pattern, and held with the particular conviction of someone who had watched her best friend get incrementally erased and had spent those same months holding her tongue because it wasn't her marriage. She was not holding her tongue now. "You need to eat something," Naomi said. She was standing at the stove in a kitchen the size of a generous closet, making jollof rice because it was the food that meant home, and Zuri was sitting at the small table by the window with her shoes off and her feet up on the opposite chair and her hands around a mug of ginger tea that had gone lukewarm. "I ate at the dinner," Zuri said. "You ate half a bowl of soup before your mother-in-law called you a foreigner in your own family's presence. That's not eating, that's surviving a meal." Zuri almost smiled. Almost. "Say what you want to say, Naomi." Naomi turned from the stove. She was a tall woman, angular, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of directness that people either loved or found unbearable. "I've been saying what I want to say for 8 months. You just haven't been listening." "I listened." "You heard me, and then you went back." Naomi put the spoon down. "I watched you make yourself smaller and smaller in that marriage, and every time I said something you told me I didn't understand the whole picture. So tell me the whole picture, Zuri. Tell me what I'm missing." "I loved him." Present tense shifting into past without Zuri noticing until she heard herself say it. She stopped, corrected. "I love him." "I know you do. That's not the question." "Then what's the question?" Naomi sat down across from her. "The question is whether he loves you enough to show up. Not with money, not with security, with actual presence, with his voice, when his mother is sitting across from you saying things that should have made him flip that table." Zuri looked out the window. The neighborhood below was already awake, food carts and morning deliveries and the sound of a school 2 blocks over getting ready to start its day. Normal life. She'd been living at a remove from normal life for so long She'd almost forgotten what it looked like up close. He did nothing, she said. It wasn't a revelation. She'd known it the moment it was happening. But saying it plainly, without softening it, without reaching for context or extenuating circumstance, felt different, felt like setting something heavy down. She called me that African woman, and he looked at his plate. Naomi didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I spent 2 years telling myself it was complicated, that the family was complicated, that his position was complicated, that I had to be patient with the way things worked. Zuri's voice stayed even, but her hands tightened around the mug. I know what complicated looks like. I'm a lawyer. I live inside complicated. What happened last night wasn't complicated. It was simple. She humiliated me in front of 30 people, and my husband looked at his plate. What do you need? Naomi said. Right now, I need to sleep, and I need you not to tell me it's going to be okay. I wasn't going to. Good. Zuri set the mug down and looked at her hands, the bare left hand. She'd taken the ring off so carefully, had set it down so precisely, and some part of her had expected that the physical act of removing it would feel like something dramatic. It hadn't. It had felt like putting down a weight she'd been carrying for so long she'd stopped noticing it was heavy. I have a prenatal appointment on Thursday. I need to call my doctor and change the address on file. I'll drive you. You don't have a car. I'll borrow one. Go sleep. Zuri slept for 11 hours. When she woke, it was dark, and Naomi had left a covered plate of rice on the table and a note that said, "Gone to work. Back by 9. Your phone has been ringing." Zuri ate the rice standing up in the kitchen, looking at her phone. 14 missed calls from Do-hyun. 3 texts. She read the texts in order. Where are you? Are you okay? 7:02 a.m. I'm not going to send anyone. I just need to know you're safe. 9:45 a.m. Zuri. 6:18 p.m. Just her name. One word. And somehow that was the hardest one to look at. She didn't call back. She turned the phone face down and finished the rice and washed the plate, and she told herself she was not ready to hear his voice, which was true, and also that hearing his voice would make something in her chest go soft in a way she couldn't afford right now, which was also true. And she stood at Naomi's small kitchen window, looking out at a city that was doing exactly what it always did, which was carry on without consulting her feelings about it. She was 34 years old and 7 months pregnant and standing in her friend's kitchen in borrowed pajamas. And she thought about her mother, who had raised her to be unbreakable, and her father, who had raised her to know her own worth. And she thought that both of them had done a good job and that being unbreakable did not mean you didn't break a little. It just meant you noticed when it was happening and you chose what to do with the pieces. She was choosing. 2 days passed, then 3. Do-hyun stopped calling on day 2. Not because he'd given up, she understood, but because he was smart enough to know that the calls weren't working and whatever came next would have to be something different. She both respected this and resented it a little. She didn't want to respect him right now. Respect made everything more complicated. On day 4, Madame Kang called Zuri directly. The number was one Zuri had stored in her phone since the first month of her marriage, labeled Do-hyun's mother because she'd never been invited to use the woman's given name. She stared at the name on the screen for 3 full rings, then answered. Zuri. Madame Kang's voice was composed, as always. Pleasant, even. I'm told you've left the house. That's right. I think we should speak in person. These misunderstandings are best resolved face to face. Zuri sat down on the edge of Naomi's narrow couch. She pressed her back against the cushions and looked at the ceiling. Misunderstandings. There's no misunderstanding, she said. You called me that African woman in front of your whole family. I understood perfectly. A pause. I was speaking generally about... You were not speaking generally. You looked directly at me. Zuri, you are being very... What? Sensitive? Clear? Her voice didn't rise. She'd learned growing up that you could be angrier with a steady voice than a raised one. I am being exact, which is what I do. It's actually part of why your son hired me in the first place. She paused. I'm not coming to see you. I don't have anything to say to you right now that would be appropriate for a daughter-in-law to say to a mother-in-law, and I was raised better than to say inappropriate things. The silence on Madame Kang's end was different from her usual silences. Stiffer. My son is a grown man, Zuri said, who makes his own choices. He made choices at that dinner table. I made mine. She breathed. Don't call me again. Not right now. She hung up. Her hands were not entirely steady. She pressed them flat against her knees and breathed through it, and then she felt the baby move. A slow, rolling shift, the kind that had started happening in the last month, unmistakable. And she put one hand on her stomach and sat there. I know, she said, to no one. I know. On day 5, Do-hyun appeared at the entrance of Naomi's building. He didn't come upstairs. He didn't call. He sent one text. I'm outside. You don't have to come down. I just needed to be closer than I was. Naomi saw it over Zuri's shoulder and said nothing, which meant she had very specific opinions she was choosing not to share, and Zuri appreciated the restraint. Zuri went to the window and looked down at the street. He was standing on the pavement in a dark coat, no bodyguards visible, though she knew they'd be somewhere close. And he was looking at his phone, and then he looked up, as if he knew she was there, and for a moment they were just looking at each other through 4 floors of Seoul air. She stepped back from the window. She texted back. Go home, Do-hyun. He replied. Okay. And then, after a moment, I'm sorry I didn't say something at the dinner. I've been trying to figure out why I didn't, and the honest answer is I didn't want to make a scene, which means I prioritized the room over you. I know that. She read it twice. She sat down on the couch and read it again. He's apologizing, she said. By text, Naomi said, aside from the kitchen. Yes. What does the apology say? She read it aloud. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then, that's actually a real apology. He didn't make excuses. He just said what he did and called it what it was. I know. That's different. I know. Are you going to respond? Zuri thought about it. Not yet, she said. He went home. But the next morning he sent a single text. Your prenatal appointment is Thursday. Do you want me there? She stared at that for a long time. He knew about Thursday because she'd put all her appointments in the shared calendar they'd set up at the beginning of the pregnancy, during those 3 weeks when he was present and trying, and she'd thought things were changing. The shared calendar she'd assumed he'd stopped looking at months ago. He'd been looking at it. She thought about what it meant that he'd been tracking her appointments even through the worst of the distance. She couldn't decide if it was reassuring or devastating. Maybe it was both. She typed, I'll think about it. He replied, That's enough. Naomi went to work on Thursday morning, leaving Zuri with the address of the clinic, a transit card, and strict instructions to text when she arrived and when she left. Zuri had agreed to all of this because arguing with Naomi about it was not a fight she had the energy for, and also because Naomi's concern was real, and the world had not been particularly gentle with Zuri lately. She was ready at 9:15, coat on, bag on her shoulder, when her phone rang. Do-hyun. She answered. I haven't decided, she said before he could speak. I know. I'm not asking you to decide. His voice was not what she expected, not the careful, controlled register he used for most things. It was tired, genuinely tired in a way that 15 years of late nights and high-stakes decision-making had presumably trained out of him. I just wanted to hear your voice. She stood in Naomi's small entryway, coat on, and said nothing. How are you sleeping? He said. And that question, that particular question, the one she had wanted him to ask her for months and months and months, cracked something open in her chest that she was not ready for. She turned toward the door so her face wouldn't be visible even to the empty room. Not great, she said. Me either. Silence. Not an empty silence. A full one. The kind that happens between two people who have too much to say and have not yet found the shape of how to say it. I want to come on Thursday, he said. If you'll let me. I won't say anything. I won't make it about us. I want to be there. She thought about it for 10 seconds. Truly thought about it. Not as a strategic decision, not as a statement, but as a simple human consideration. Did she want him there? Did some part of her, underneath the hurt and the exhaustion and the weeks of silence, want the father of her child standing in that room when the doctor ran the ultrasound and the heartbeat filled the room? Yes. Underneath everything, yes. Meet me there, she said. Don't be late. He arrived 8 minutes early. She saw him when she turned the corner toward the clinic entrance. He was standing outside, no coat despite the cold, looking in the opposite direction. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and something moved across his face that he didn't try to hide or manage, and that too was different. He'd always been so composed in every public-facing moment. He looked like a man who'd spent 5 days in a state of sustained interior reckoning, and it had taken something out of him. Good, some part of her thought. And then, I don't actually want to hurt him. And then, why did I marry someone I have to remind myself I don't want to hurt? You're early, she said. I said I would be here. He looked at her, not at her stomach, at her face. You look tired. You're not supposed to say that. You always said you hated it when people lied to be polite. She almost laughed. Almost. Come on, she said, and walked through this door. The appointment was 40 minutes. The doctor, a small practical woman named Dr. Yoon, who'd been Zuri's obstetrician for 5 months, and who registered Do-hyun's presence with the professionally neutral expression of someone who had seen every variation of partnership and asked questions of none of them, walked them through the standard assessment. Blood pressure, weight, questions about sleep, which Zuri answered honestly and which made Do-hyun's jaw tighten in a way she noticed from the corner of her eye. Then Dr. Yoon set up the ultrasound. The room was small. The lights were low. The gel was cold, and Zuri made an involuntary sound when it touched her skin, and Do-hyun, who was sitting in the chair to her left, leaned forward very slightly. The screen came on. Dr. Yoon moved the probe, and there, immediately, unmistakably, right there on the screen, was their daughter. Zuri had seen the ultrasound images before. She'd been to appointments without him, and had looked at the images alone, and had felt a complex layering of love and grief about the fact of that aloneness. But she had not been in a room with Do-hyun when he saw it. She turned her head to look at him. I was staring at the screen, absolutely still. His hands were on his knees, and he was staring at the image of his daughter on the monitor, and his face had done something she didn't have a word for. Not the controlled collapse of a man having a moment, but the specific involuntary undoing of someone encountering something that is simply bigger than every wall they have ever built. She's measuring well, Dr. Yoon was saying. Growth is right on track. And then the heartbeat. Dr. Yoon activated the audio, and the room filled with the rapid, rhythmic percussion of a small heart working hard, doing its job with the absolute commitment of something that doesn't yet know the world is difficult. Do-hyun made a sound. It was quiet. It was barely anything. But in the low light of that small room, it was the loudest thing Zuri had ever heard from him. A single, compressed exhalation that was not quite a breath and not quite a word, and when she looked at his face, there were tears running down it, just on one side, just one, and he didn't wipe it, didn't move, didn't do anything except sit there and listen to his daughter's heartbeat, like it was the only thing left in the world that was completely and irrefutably real. Zuri looked back at the screen. Her own eyes were burning. She did not reach for his hand. She wanted to. She was aware of exactly how much she wanted to, and she was also aware that wanting something and being ready to do it were two entirely separate conditions, and she was not ready, and she had promised herself that she would not let the wanting override the knowing. But when the appointment ended and they walked out of the clinic into the cold soul air and stood on the pavement, and he turned to her with his face still slightly raw and said, "Thank you for letting me be there." She looked at him for a long moment and said, "She deserves to have her father there." Not "I forgive you." Not "it's going to be okay." Just that. She deserves to have her father there. He heard what she wasn't saying. She could see him hear it. His jaw worked once, and he nodded. "I know I can't fix the last 2 years with one afternoon," he said. "I'm not trying to. I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm not telling you so you'll come home. I'm telling you because it's true, and you deserve to hear it." She waited. "My mother has been saying things to you, things I didn't know the full extent of, since before we were married." He paused. The controlled executive voice had dropped entirely. What was underneath it was rougher and less polished, and considerably more honest. "I knew it wasn't good. I told myself I was managing it. I wasn't managing anything. I was looking the other way because confronting her was harder than pretending everything was functional." He met her eyes. "That was a failure. My failure. Not yours." The street was busy around them. Deliveries and pedestrians and a school group going past in a long, noisy line. Normal life doing its thing. You said that at the dinner table, Zuri said. With your silence. Yes. Your mother called you the head of a great dynasty, Do-hyun, and you sat there while she told me I was an outsider in my own family, and you calculated whether intervening would make things awkward. His eyes didn't move. Yes. That's not a small thing. No, he said. It's not. The school group finished passing. The street normalized. Zuri adjusted her bag on her shoulder and looked at the pavement for a moment and then back at him. I can't come home yet, she said. I'm not ready to come home. I know. I don't know when I'll be ready. Maybe not for a long time. Okay. Don't send anyone to watch Naomi's building. I know you know the address. I know you already know exactly what floor I'm on and who else lives in that building. Don't put anyone there. A beat. Something moved behind his eyes. Okay? And the next time your mother says something, anything, to me or about me. There won't be a next time, he said. His voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard from him before. Not the cold authority of the Mafia Boss, and not the raw vulnerability of the last 10 minutes. Something between them, or maybe beyond them, certain in a way that was quiet rather than loud. I'll make that clear to her this week. Zuri looked at him. You've said that before. I know. I didn't follow through. He held her gaze. Watch me follow through. She didn't say yes, and she didn't say no. She turned and walked toward the transit stop, and he watched her go and did not follow. She was halfway down the block when she stopped. She didn't turn around. She just stopped walking for a moment, standing on the pavement with the city moving around her, her hand resting on her stomach where her daughter was shifting, slowly, like something working itself into a better position. Then she kept walking. Behind her, Do-hyun stood outside the clinic for a long time before he finally moved. He pulled out his phone. He called one number. His mother answered on the second ring. Do-hyun, we need to talk, he said. Tonight, in person. Not a conversation I'm going to have twice. A pause. About what? About what you've been doing to my wife. The word wife came out with a weight he put there deliberately. And about what it stops looking like going forward. The silence on his mother's end this time was not the controlled, managed silence of a woman maintaining her composure. It was the silence of someone who had just realized that the geography of power in a room had shifted and that the shift was permanent. Do-hyun, she started carefully. Tonight, he said, and hung up. He stood on the pavement outside the clinic and looked in the direction Zuri had gone, though she was already out of sight. He put the phone in his pocket. He felt the ring there too because he'd been carrying it since the morning he'd found it, because he could not bring himself to put it back in the house where it would just sit on a nightstand waiting for something he hadn't earned yet. He started walking. He had a conversation with his mother to get through, and then, if it went the way he intended, if he could manage to say the things that needed saying without flinching, without prioritizing the room the way he always had, maybe he would be one step closer to being someone his wife could consider coming home to. Maybe. He wasn't counting on it. He didn't think he'd earned the right to count on anything yet. But the baby's heartbeat was still playing somewhere in the back of his chest, rapid and constant and completely indifferent to his calculations. And for the first time in 15 years, Kang Do-hyun walked into a situation with no strategy, no contingency, nothing but the truth he was going to have to find the words for, whether they came out clean or not. His mother's door was going to open, and whatever he said when it did was going to determine whether anything could be salvaged, not just his marriage, but his own understanding of the man he'd become so quietly that he'd never even noticed the becoming. Madame Kang's house smelled like chrysanthemums and old money, the way it always had, the way Do-hyun had grown up breathing without noticing it. He noticed it now. He stood in the entryway of the family compound, and a housekeeper took his coat, and he walked through the hall toward the sitting room where his mother received people. Not guests, she didn't call them guests. She called them people she received, and he registered the smell the way you register something that once felt like home and no longer quite does. She was already seated when he came in. Tea service on the low table, 2 cups. She'd known he wouldn't refuse to come, and she'd prepared accordingly. That was Madame Kang, always one arrangement ahead of the conversation, always in control of the furniture of a situation before anyone else arrived. She looked up when he entered. Her face arranged itself into something maternal and composed. Sit down. You look terrible. I'm not here for tea, he said, but he sat. Old habits. She poured anyway. She set the cup in front of him and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who has survived 63 years by never being the first one to say the difficult thing. Do-hyun put his hands on his knees. He'd rehearsed this in the car, not scripted it, just built the architecture of what needed to be said. He'd done that his whole life, walked into difficult conversations with the load-bearing structure already in place. It had always worked. Boards, legal arguments, rival syndicate negotiations. Give him 5 minutes of preparation and he could hold a room. He opened his mouth. And what came out was not the architecture. What came out was, how long? His mother tilted her head slightly. How long what? How long have you been saying things to her? His voice was even. Almost too even, the way water is flat right before something moves underneath it. The real things. Not the things you said at the table in front of everyone, the things you said when I wasn't in the room. A pause. The chrysanthemums sat in their vase and didn't move. I've always been honest with that girl about the realities of, that girl is my wife. The flatness in his voice developed an edge, not a raised edge, a honed one. And I asked you a question. Madame Kang looked at her tea, a gesture, small and deliberate, of someone recalibrating. I have spoken to Zuri on numerous occasions about the expectations of this family, about what it means to carry the Kang name, about the importance of, what did you say to her at her first family dinner? He said. The one in February 2 years ago, when I was in Busan for 3 days and you hosted the extended family and Zuri attended alone. His mother went still. I know she attended, he said. I know I wasn't there. I know you hosted. I didn't know what happened at that dinner until 4 days ago when Junho pulled the household staff records from that week, and I found out that Zuri's driver brought her home 2 hours before the dinner was scheduled to end. The staff have no business. What happened at that dinner? She set her cup down. Something shifted in her posture. Not collapse, Madame Kang didn't collapse, but a kind of settling, the way a structure settles when it accepts that the wind isn't stopping. I told her the truth, that the family had concerns about the nature of your relationship, that there were questions about her background that certain members of the family would inevitably raise, that she might find it easier, kinder, I said to herself, to consider whether she was truly prepared for the weight of what marrying into this family required. The room was very quiet. You told her that, Do-hyun said, 2 months into our marriage. I was trying to... You told my wife 2 months into our marriage that she might want to reconsider being married to me. That is not what I... That is exactly what you did. He stood up. He didn't do it dramatically. He just stood, because sitting was no longer something his body could manage. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the compound garden, the careful manicured lines of it, everything arranged, everything in its proper place. What else? Do-hyun, what else did you say to her? Not just at that dinner, at any of them, in the car, in the hallways, on the phone. What else? The silence went on long enough that he turned around. His mother was looking at her hands, and he realized, with a cold shock that moved through him from his collar to his feet, that she was not preparing an answer. She was deciding how much of an answer to give, not whether she'd said things, whether to tell him what things. He'd known it was bad. He'd been preparing himself, in the car, for bad. He had not prepared himself for the specific expression on his mother's face, which was not guilt, not quite, but was the near relative of guilt, the look of a person calculating the cost of disclosure. Tell me, he said, quietly, with the particular quiet of someone who has stopped calculating entirely. And she told him. It came out in pieces, in the careful language his mother always used, qualified, contextual, framed as concern rather than hostility. But underneath the framing, what she was describing was 2 years of sustained, methodical erosion. Comments about Zuri's appearance at family events. Observations, delivered to cousins and aunts and family-adjacent associates, about the peculiarities of Do-hyun's choice. A conversation with one of Do-hyun's senior lieutenants, a man named Seo, who'd been with the organization for 12 years, in which Madame Kang had suggested, with considerable delicacy, that Zuri's continued presence in Do-hyun's life was creating instabilities that a man in his position could not afford. A conversation with Seo. Do-hyun heard that, and something happened in his chest that was not quite emotion and not quite rage. It was the precise, crystalline sensation of a man realizing that the threat he'd been managing on the outside of his life had been growing inside it all along. "You talked to Seo," he said. I expressed concerns. "He is a loyal—" "You talked to one of my lieutenants about the stability of my marriage." His voice had gone somewhere very quiet and very cold. "You understand what that means. You understand what men in my position do with information like that, what the people around me do with it. You went to a man who operates in a world where instability is an opportunity, and you handed him a narrative." His mother's chin lifted. "I was protecting—" "You were undermining." The word came out clean, surgical. "Whether you knew it or not, you were undermining my position with my own organization by suggesting that my wife was a liability." He stared at her. "Do you understand what you've done?" "I understand that that woman walked out of this house. Her name is Zuri." He said it the way he said things to people who had tried his patience to its absolute end. Not loudly, not with theatrical force, just exactly, specifically, in the precise register that had caused grown men to recalculate their life choices. "Her name is Zuri. My wife's name is Zuri. You will say her name, or you will say nothing." Madame Kang's mouth closed. He turned and picked up his jacket from the chair. His hands were completely steady, which cost him something he wasn't going to examine right now. "You will not contact her again, not by phone, not through family members, not through the staff. You will not attend any medical appointments, any family events she is present at, any occasion she might be at, unless she explicitly invites you. And you will not—" He paused and looked at his mother with an expression she had never once seen on his face in 60 years of knowing it. "You will never say another word about her background, her race, her origin, or her place in this family, to anyone, in any context. If I hear that you have, I will not argue with you about it. I will simply stop coming here, and you will spend the rest of your life explaining to this family why your son doesn't visit." He put his jacket on. The silence in the room was total. "Do-hyun." Her voice, for the first time in his memory, had something fragile in it. He stopped at the door. He didn't turn around. "She is the mother of my child," he said. "She is the woman I failed to protect. Those are the two facts I'm going to spend however long it takes making right. And you are not going to be an obstacle to that. Do you understand me?" He didn't wait for an answer. He walked out of the compound into the cold, and the door closed behind him, and he stood beside his car for a moment in the dark and pressed his hand flat against the roof and breathed. Just breathed. The garden lights were on behind the compound walls, and the city hummed its constant hum in every direction, and he was shaking, very slightly, barely, the kind of trembling that happens when the body has been held at rigid tension for too long and something finally releases. He hadn't known about the dinner in February. He hadn't known about Seo. Seo. He got into the car and told the driver to take him to the office, and he sat in the back with his phone in his hand and his mind running through the last 2 years with the specific, terrible attention of a man who has just been handed a new set of eyes and can't stop looking. He had known his mother disapproved. He had told himself he was managing it. He had prioritized operational stability, the Busan situation, the audit, the 3 lieutenants who'd been arrested, over the quiet, private war his mother had been waging against his wife inside the walls of his own family. And now Seo. Seo, who had been in the room for 12 years, who knew the organization's pressure points, who had access to information about the consortium negotiations that were happening right now, in real time, with rival syndicates from 3 separate regions. Seo, to whom Madame Kang had suggested that Kang Do-hyun's marriage was creating instabilities. In Do-hyun's world, instability was not an abstract concept. It was an invitation. He called Park Junho from the car. "Pull everything on Seo from the last 6 months. Meetings, contacts, financials, movements, everything. Tonight." Junho's voice was careful. "You think there's a problem?" "I think I've been looking in the wrong direction." He paused. "How's the consortium negotiation sitting?" "We're scheduled for the full summit Thursday. 3 syndicates, neutral ground, the framework we've been building for 4 months. 4 months of negotiation. The kind of framework that only worked if every party believed the Kang organization was unified, stable, led by a man whose internal situation was clean. The kind of framework that collapsed if someone with access to the right information decided to introduce doubt at the right moment. Keep Thursday as scheduled, Do-hyun said. Don't tell anyone I asked about Seo. Understood. He hung up. The car moved through Seoul traffic, and he sat in the dark and thought about Zuri and Naomi's apartment, 4 floors up, sleeping badly, and he thought about the baby's heartbeat in that clinical room, and then he thought about Seo and his mother and the 2 years of compound damage, and the combination of those 3 things produced a feeling he could not categorize, except as the specific nauseating clarity of a man seeing the full picture for the first time, and understanding that every mistake he made had been made in the blind spot he'd created himself. Junho called back in 40 minutes. Do-hyun was at his office, jacket off, at his desk. There's something, Junho said. Tell me. Seo met 3 times in the last 2 months with a man named Choi Byung-jun, private citizen on paper, but he's the financial operator for the Incheon Group, the ones who want the Western Corridor territory we'd be ceding in the Thursday framework. Do-hyun was very still. What kind of meetings? Dinner? Private rooms? Off schedule? No organizational record? A pause. The 3rd meeting was 6 days ago. 2 days before you and Madam Kang last spoke. 6 days ago. 2 days before. And Thursday was the summit. 4 months of framework, 3 syndicates, neutral ground. SEO knows the concession points, Do-hyun said. He was in the room for all of them. He knows what we're giving up and what we're holding. He knows our bottom line. Yes. Do-hyun set the phone down without hanging up, placed both hands flat on the desk, and looked at the wall. 12 years. Seo had been with the organization for 12 years. He'd been in the room for negotiations that Do-hyun had never let more than 4 people attend. He'd been trusted at the level that you only trusted someone when you'd stopped thinking of them as a variable. The Incheon Group had been trying to break the Western Corridor deal for 8 months. Every approach had failed. Every legal mechanism, every backroom pressure, every rival they'd tried to incite. Nothing had worked because the Kong organization's internal position had been solid, until his mother had a conversation about instabilities. And Seo had seen an opening. He picked the phone back up. Where's Seo now? His apartment. He came home at 8:15, no outgoing calls since. Keep eyes on him. Don't approach. Don't spook him. Do-hyun's voice was operating on a different frequency now. The problem-solving frequency. The one he'd been running on for 15 years. The one that went very smooth and very cold. If he reaches out to Choi or anyone associated with Incheon before Thursday, I want to know within 5 minutes. And Thursday itself? Thursday happens, Do-hyun said. Exactly as scheduled. We let him come. He hung up. He sat at his desk for a moment, and then he did something he very rarely did. He picked up his personal phone, not the operational one, and looked at Zuri's name in his contacts. He did not call. He sat there and looked at her name. He needed to tell her that he'd spoken to his mother. He told her he would do it this week, and he'd done it tonight, and she deserved to know. But it was past 10 o'clock and she was sleeping badly, and the last thing she needed was a call from him that would pull her out of whatever rest she was managing to get. He put the phone down. He picked it up again and typed, I talked to her tonight, said what needed to be said. I'll tell you everything if you want to know. Sleep well. He sent it and put the phone face down and tried to focus on the Seo problem, which was at least a problem he had a framework for. 3 days passed. Do-hyun ran 2 parallel operations, the Consortium Summit preparation, which continued in its scheduled form with Seo in his usual place in the inner team, and the surveillance on Seo, which revealed a 4th meeting with Choi, brief and coded and conducted over lunch in a place Seo clearly thought was unmonitored. It was not unmonitored. Zuri had texted back, Okay, tell me when you're ready. How did she take it? He'd replied, the way she takes everything. But she heard me. A pause, then, she won't contact you again. I made that absolute. A longer pause from Zuri's end, and then, thank you, 2 words. He held them longer than they probably warranted. But thank you from Zuri, in the current geography of their situation, was not a small thing. It was evidence that she was watching, that she noticed what he did when the doing was hard. He did not hear from his mother. Her silence confirmed more effectively than any response could have that she'd understood exactly what he meant. On Thursday morning, Do-hyun arrived at the summit venue, a private conference space in a hotel in Gangnam, neutral enough that none of the three syndicates had home advantage, with his full inner team, including Seo. He greeted the other syndicate's representatives with the composed authority that was simply his natural register at these things. He moved through pre-meeting pleasantries with the precision of a man who had been doing this since his mid-20s. Seo sat 3 chairs to his right, as always. Attentive, professional, 12 years of reliable presence. Do-hyun did not look at him differently. He would not give him that. The negotiations began. They ran through the morning framework without incident, hitting each concession point in sequence, building the architecture of the agreement in the methodical way these things were built. By midday, they had a working draft of the Western Corridor terms. Then the lead representative from the Incheon-adjacent faction, not Choi himself, but a proxy, a man named Park Won-soo, who Do-hyun had met twice and assessed as intelligent but not original, set a document on the table. "Before we finalize the corridor terms," Park Won-soo said, "we'd like to address some concerns that have come to our attention regarding the long-term stability of the Kong organization's leadership capacity." The room went still. Do-hyun looked at the document. He didn't touch it. "What kind of concerns?" Park Won-soo's expression was the carefully calibrated neutrality of a man who had been coached on what to say and was saying it. Internal tensions, domestic disruptions at the leadership level, the kind of circumstance that, in our experience, tends to affect decision-making capacity over time. We want assurance that the party we're entering a framework with is, a small pause, cohesive. The other two syndicates' representatives were very still. Everyone in the room understood what this was, a destabilization play, and everyone in the room was waiting to see how Do-hyun handled it. Do-hyun let the silence sit for 4 seconds. He counted. 4 seconds of a room full of powerful men waiting to see if the accusation had found a target. Then he said, "Which member of my organization spoke to you about this?" "Not what are you talking about? Not I deny any instability." He went straight to the source, stated it as a fact rather than a question, and watched Park Won-soo's composure develop a hairline fracture. "I'm not in a position to—" "You're sitting at my table making claims about my organization's internal structure," Do-hyun said. "Those claims came from somewhere. Either you tell me where, or we treat this as a bad faith insertion, and we stop the summit right now." The room was completely quiet. Do-hyun did not look at Seo. He sat perfectly still, perfectly composed, looking at Park Won-soo, and waited. Park Won-soo glanced, briefly and involuntarily, to his right, where his organization's additional representative was seated. Do-hyun caught the glance. So did Junho, 2 seats away. "I'd like a 5-minute recess," Do-hyun said. His voice had the pleasant tone of someone suggesting nothing in particular. He stood. He walked out of the conference room. Junho and 2 other members of his inner team followed. Seo stood to follow as well. Do-hyun turned in the doorway and looked at him. "Stay," he said. Seo stayed. In the hallway, Do-hyun turned to Junho. How does he want to handle this? It wasn't a question about Seo's preference. It was a question about which version of this story they were going to tell when it was over. Junho said quietly, "He has a family." "I know he has a family." Do-hyun walked to the end of the corridor and stood at the window and looked out at the city and thought about that, about what it meant that Seo, a man with a family, had looked at the information available to him and calculated that undermining Do-hyun's standing was worth the risk. What it would have taken to make that calculation. What he'd been told or believed or decided about the odds. His mother's voice came back to him. Instabilities. She hadn't known what she was handing Seo. He believed that. She was a woman of a certain world, one where gossip and social maneuvering were the primary tools of influence. She had no framework for understanding that the same information operated differently in Do-hyun's world. She'd handed a match to a man standing in a room full of things that burned and had no idea what she was doing. Seo had known exactly what he was doing. "Pull him from the organization cleanly," Do-hyun said. "End of day. He keeps his pension because of the family and because 12 years is 12 years. He signs the standard agreements and he is done. No further action." Junho's expression was carefully neutral. "The others will see that as lenient." "The others will see it as confident," Do-hyun said. "A man who's actually unstable doesn't handle a betrayal by being magnanimous. He panics. He escalates." He turned from the window. I'm going back in there and finishing this summit. Have Seo's exit handled before we're done. He walked back into the conference room. He sat down. He looked at Park Won-soo with an expression of absolute composure and said, "The concern you raised has been addressed internally. It will not recur. Now, shall we finish what we came here to do?" The summit concluded at 5:15. The Western Corridor Framework was signed. The Incheon-adjacent faction signed it without their destabilization play having gained an inch, because a man who handles a public challenge with that particular quality of calm either has nothing to hide or is dangerous enough that finding out isn't worth the cost. The calculation was the same either way. Do-hyun shook hands. He said the appropriate things. He walked out of the hotel into the late afternoon light of a Thursday and stood on the pavement, and his hands were completely steady, and his chest felt like something had been compressed inside it for weeks, and only now, out here, in the cold, had enough room to shift. He got into the car. He sat for a moment. Then he picked up his personal phone. He almost called. He wanted to call. He wanted to tell her what had happened. Not the full operational detail. She knew the shape of his world without needing the specific coordinates. But the essential thing, that his mother's conversation with Seo had nearly unraveled a 4-month framework, that he had let it happen by not paying attention to the right things, that the neglect he'd brought to his marriage had opened a door in his organization that his enemies had tried to walk through. He wanted to tell her that the personal and the professional were not separate chambers in his life, that his failure to protect her had created structural damage he was still measuring. He held the phone. He didn't call. Instead he drove. Not to the office, not home. He drove to Mapogu, and he parked a block from Naomi's building, and he sat in the car in the dark and looked at the 4th-floor window where a light was on. He was not going in. He hadn't earned going in. But he sat there. Because he'd spent 2 years being somewhere else when he should have been closer, and while he couldn't fix those 2 years, he could start building the record of the man he was trying to become. One evening, one decision, one refusal to be somewhere easier when the right place was uncomfortable. He didn't know if she could see the car from the window. He didn't know if she even knew he was there. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was not Zuri. It was a number he didn't recognize. No name in the directory, the prefix indicating a disposable carrier. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. "Mr. Kang." The voice was male, not young, measured in the way of someone reading from a prepared statement. "I represent parties with an interest in your current domestic situation. We have documentation of conversations between your mother and Mr. Seo Kyung-soo spanning 11 months. We also have records of communications between Mr. Seo and parties in Incheon that I suspect you are only partially aware of." A pause. "We are prepared to share these records in exchange for your withdrawal from the Western Corridor framework you finalized this afternoon." The car was very quiet. Do-hyun looked at the 4th-floor window where the light was on. "You're saying you've been watching my family," he said. "We've been watching your organization. Your family became relevant when certain members became, shall we say, accessible." Accessible. The word sat in his ear like something cold. "If you are saying," Do-hyun said, his voice at its absolute flattest, "that any member of my family has been accessed, nothing has happened," the voice said, quickly, carefully, which told Do-hyun that the quickness was deliberate. A message that nothing had happened yet, with the implication of yet left completely unspoken. "We simply want you to know the scope of our awareness, and to consider whether the Western Corridor is worth the complications that continued engagement might produce." The light in the 4th-floor window went off. Do-hyun sat in the dark and looked at the building where his pregnant wife was sleeping, and he understood, with the cold, crystalline clarity of a man who had just seen the board reset entirely, that the threat was no longer about business. It was about Zuri. It was about his daughter. Everything he'd been managing, the Busan situation, the summit, Seo's betrayal, his mother's interference, all of it had been visible, processable, the kind of problem that 15 years in his world had equipped him to handle. This was not that kind of problem. He had spent 2 years so focused on the empire that he had left the people inside his own life unguarded. And someone had noticed. He lowered the phone. His jaw was tight. Every trained instinct in his body said, "Move. Protect. Harden the perimeter. Send men to the building. Move Zuri somewhere secure. Begin the counter-operation. But Zuri had said, don't put anyone there. And she was already gone from one home because he had chosen strategy over presence. He sat in the car in the dark and understood, for the first time with his whole chest rather than just his mind, that there was no version of the next decision that didn't cost him something fundamental. Either he moved without her knowledge and treated her safety as a problem to be solved and destroyed whatever fragile progress they'd made, or he called her right now and told her the truth. All of it. The man he'd been for 15 years would have made the first choice without hesitation. His thumb found her name in his contacts. He pressed call. It rang twice. Then her voice, not groggy, she hadn't been sleeping, said, Do-hyun. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need you to hear it before I do anything else, because whatever comes next, I'm not going to make the decision without you knowing. A silence. Then, tell me. And Kang Do-hyun, who had run a criminal empire for 15 years, on the principle that information was power, and power was held by the person who chose what to share, told his wife everything. She didn't say anything for a long time after he finished. He told her everything, not the sanitized version, not the executive summary he would have given a lieutenant or a lawyer. Everything. The call, the voice, the word accessible and what it meant in his world. Theo, and his mother's conversation with Seo, and the way the two of them together had created an opening that someone with significant resources and no compunctions had decided to walk through. He told her all of it in one long, largely uninterrupted account, sitting in his car in the dark outside her building. And when he finished, the silence on her end was not the silence of someone in shock. It was the silence of someone thinking. That was Zuri. Even now. Even at 8 months pregnant at 11 o'clock at night, the lawyer in her didn't switch off. She was processing, categorizing. He could almost hear the mechanism of her mind working through it. The voice on the phone, she said finally. Male, prepared, reading from something. That's not the principal. That's an intermediary. Yes. Which means whoever is actually running this is careful. They're not going to expose themselves directly. Also, yes. A breath. Do-hyun, how exposed is Naomi's address? To the people who made that call? I don't know yet. That's what I need to find out tonight. Tonight. Her voice had a particular quality. Not panic, nothing close to panic, but a tightening. The sound of someone deciding how scared they're allowed to be. What do you need to do tonight? I need you to not be alone. He stopped. Started again. I want to tell you what I think the right move is, and then I want you to tell me if you're willing, because I'm not doing this the way I've done everything else. Another silence. Shorter this time. Tell me. I think you need to move. Not to the penthouse. I'm not asking that. Somewhere else. Somewhere I can have people on without you feeling like you're under guard. He pressed his thumb against his mouth for a second, thinking through the phrasing. I own a building in Yongsan. Small. Residential on the surface. The top unit has been empty for 2 years. It's clean, it's not connected to my name in any paper trail, and I can have 3 people in the building and 2 outside without anyone knowing they're mine. You want to move me into a safe house. I want to move you somewhere that I know is secure while I find out who made that call and what they actually have. The line was quiet enough that he could hear her breathing. Naomi, she said, she can come. The unit is large enough. You've had this property for 2 years. Yes. And you've never mentioned it. It's operational infrastructure. It's not something He stopped. Because what he'd been about to say was, it's not something I told you about, because there are parts of my world I kept separate from you, and that sentence, in the current context, was perhaps the most damning thing he could offer. No, I haven't mentioned it. I should have. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Not bitter exactly, just worn. There's a lot you should have mentioned. I know. I'm going to wake Naomi up, she said. Give me 20 minutes. He exhaled. Zuri, don't say thank you. Don't say anything like that. Her voice was steady, but it had an edge under it, the kind that came from someone holding something together through will alone. Just make sure the building is what you say it is. And Do-hyun, if at any point you make a decision about my safety without telling me, I will leave again, somewhere you won't find me. Understood. 20 minutes. She hung up. He called Junho immediately. By the time Zuri and Naomi came out of the building 45 minutes later, Naomi with a rolling suitcase and the particular expression of a woman who had been woken up with bad news and had processed it with remarkable speed, Zuri with her 2 bags and her coat, and her face arranged into the careful composure of someone navigating a situation they had not chosen. Do Hyun's team had swept the Yongsan unit, confirmed the perimeter, and positioned 3 people in the building with 2 more in vehicles outside. He got out of the car when he saw them. Naomi looked at him. It was the first time they'd met in person, and she did not extend her hand and she did not say hello. She looked at him the way someone looks at a structure they're assessing for load-bearing failures. Then she looked at Zuri. "This your call?" Naomi said to her. "Yes," Zuri said. Naomi picked up her suitcase. "Then let's go." Do-hyun drove them himself. No driver. He needed the driver elsewhere tonight. The 3 of them sat in the car, Naomi in the back with Zuri, and nobody said anything unnecessary, and the city moved past the windows, bright and relentless, and he watched Zuri in the rearview mirror, and she was looking out the window with her hand on her stomach and her jaw set, and he thought, she is the most composed person I have ever known, and I spent 2 years mistaking her composure for fine. The Yongsan unit was clean, modern, anonymous. Good furniture, no personal touches. The kind of space that could belong to anyone, which was the point. Naomi did a circuit of the rooms without comment. Zuri stood in the main space and looked around and then looked at Do-hyun. "Who are the people in this building?" 2 men on the floor below, 1 at the entrance. "Are they armed?" "Yes." "Are they going to come up here unless I tell them to?" "No." She nodded once. "Show me which one is Junho." He called Junho up. Junho appeared in the doorway, a compact man in his mid-40s with a face that communicated almost nothing, and Zuri looked at him for a long moment and then said, in Korean, "If anything happens and you can't reach him, you call me directly. You have my number." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Junho said, without hesitation, without looking at Do-hyun for confirmation. Zuri turned back to Do-hyun. "Go do what you need to do," she said, "but I want to call by 6 a.m. with whatever you found." "You should sleep." "I'll sleep when I know what we're dealing with." She held his gaze. 6 a.m. He left. The night that followed was not the kind Do-hyun had spent in a long time. Not strategically, not operationally, not in the specific way that required him to move through the dark parts of the world he'd built and use every tool available to him. He'd been spending his nights lately in offices and cars and the edge of an empty bed. He'd almost forgotten what it felt like to work the machinery in full. He started with the phone number. The disposable carrier traced to a batch purchased 3 weeks earlier at a convenience chain, untraceable in the ordinary sense. But the call had bounced through 2 relays before reaching him, and the relay servers had logs. And he had a man who was very good at reading logs who owed him a significant favor. By 1 a.m., the favor had been called in. By 2 a.m., they had an originating cell tower, placing the call in a specific commercial district in Jung-gu. By 2:40, cross-referencing with known associates of the Incheon Group's financial operations and surveillance footage. Junho's team pulled from 3 nearby buildings. They had a face. Not Choi Byom-jun, not anyone from Incheon directly, a man named Ryo Song-il. 61 years old. Former prosecutor's office, middle tier, retired 5 years earlier with a pension and no public profile. The kind of man who existed specifically to not exist on anyone's radar. The professional ghost that every large-scale criminal or political operation kept on payroll for the moments when they needed something done at a remove. Do-hyun looked at Ryo's photograph on his laptop screen and felt the cold current of recognition move through him. He'd seen this shape of operation before. Someone was using Incheon as the visible hand and keeping their actual involvement completely separate. Incheon was a proxy. Ryo was a tool. Neither of them was the source. He called Junho. Who does Ryo work for? Not who he's been seen with, who does he actually work for, the last 3 years? Junho was quiet for 30 seconds, presumably scrolling. Then, he's been connected to 2 entities. A private equity firm registered in the Caymans, shell on top of shell, we'd need a week to bottom out who owns it, and a domestic construction conglomerate with significant government contracting exposure. Another pause. The construction entity is, "Sir, it's Kim Dae-jung." Do-hyun closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then opened them. Kim Dae-jung. The single name that changed everything. Kim Dae-jung was not a crime figure. He was not, in any official or documentable sense, connected to criminal operations at all. I was a 70-year-old construction magnate whose firm had built a third of the infrastructure in the Greater Seoul area over the past 30 years. He sat on 3 cultural foundation boards. He had a grandchild in primary school who appeared in magazine profiles twice a year. He gave commencement addresses at universities. He was also the man whose organization had been quietly, methodically purchasing political influence in the Western Seoul districts for 6 years. The Western Corridor, the territory that Do-hyun's consortium framework would have ceded to a neutral administrative arrangement, ran directly through 3 major development parcels that Kim Dae-jung's construction interests needed access to in order to complete a government contract worth 11 billion won. The consortium framework, if it held, would create a territorial stability agreement that made those parcels administratively complicated for anyone seeking exclusive access. Kim Dae-jung didn't care about criminal syndicates. He cared about concrete and contracts. The framework was in his way. And someone, Ryo, almost certainly, with Incheon as the leverage point, had identified Zuri as the most efficient pressure point available. Do-hyun sat with this information for 4 minutes. He didn't move. He breathed through it. Zuri was not in danger because of who she was. She was in danger because of who he was. Because he had built something large enough to threaten a man with 11 billion reasons to dismantle it. And that man had looked at the Kong organization and found the soft place where it could be pushed. He told Zuri he was going to stop treating his personal life like a separate chamber from his professional one. He hadn't fully understood, saying it, what that would cost him. Understood now. The cost was this night, this information, this specific knowledge that the woman carrying his child was sleeping in a building he owned in Yongsan because the life he'd built had made her a target. He pulled on his jacket. He told Junho to stay at the Yongsan building perimeter. He told him he was going alone, which Junho protested with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been protesting Do-hyun's loan decisions for years and knew the protest would fail. It failed. Ryo Song-il's apartment was in a building in Junggu that backed against a commercial arcade, the kind of building that wealthy retirees sometimes chose because it was close to the city's better restaurants and far enough from the tourist areas to feel residential. Do-hyun arrived at 3:15 a.m. He did not call ahead. He rode the elevator to the 8th floor and knocked on the door. It took 3 knocks and 90 seconds. When the door opened, Ryu was in a robe, glasses absent, blinking against the hallway light. He was older in person than in his photograph. Softer. The belly and the sloped shoulders of a man who had spent 30 years managing threats from behind a desk and had let his physical self go without consequence. He looked at Do-hyun and went completely still. "May I come in?" Do-hyun said. Not a question. Ryo stepped back. The apartment was the apartment of a man who lived alone and read extensively. Bookshelves on 3 walls, a low table with a half-finished glass of water, a television on mute showing the overnight news. It smelled like tobacco, old and absorbed into the walls rather than recent. Do-hyun sat down in the chair across from the sofa without being invited and looked at Ryo, who remained standing. "Sit down," Do-hyun said. Ryo sat. "You called me this evening," Do-hyun said. "On behalf of interests connected to Kim Dae-jung, you used language that implied my family was within your reach." He placed his hands on his knees. "I'm here to clarify whether that was a tactical statement or a literal one." Ryo's face moved through several things in quick succession. Fear, calculation, the particular composure of a former prosecutor reasserting itself over both. "I don't know what—" "Don't," Do-hyun said, simply, calmly. "You've seen what happens when people waste my time with the first denial. Skip it." A silence. Ryo looked at the table. His hands were in his lap, visible, which Do-hyun noted as a deliberate choice, showing he wasn't reaching for anything. Smart. "It was a tactical statement," Ryo said. "We have documentation. We do not have operational capacity to. We are not in the business of physical action." Kim Dae-jung. Ryo looked up. The name in the open air of his apartment seemed to land differently than whatever he'd been prepared for. "He wants the Western Corridor framework dissolved," Do-hyun said. "He needs the Changshin and Sindong parcels administratively unencumbered before Q1. The consortium agreement prevents that. He sent you to find a pressure point, and you identified my wife. He waited. Is that accurate? Rio's jaw worked. He was deciding something. The internal calculation was visible, the way it's visible in anyone who has spent their career on the side of information and is suddenly on the wrong side of it. The identification was mine, he said finally. The directive was to find leverage. I identified the domestic situation as the most viable pressure point, given the recent separation. His and Zuri's separation, their private crisis, had been visible enough. Through Seo, through his mother's indiscretion, through whatever network of observation Rio maintained, to be catalogued as leverage. Where is the documentation you referenced? Server-based, external, not on any device in this apartment. Rio met his eyes. He had steadied, Do-hyun noticed. Steadied the way people steadied when they realized the immediate danger was not the kind that manifested quickly. Mr. Kong, I want you to understand that I am not your enemy. I am a contractor. Kim Dae-jung retained me because of my history with the prosecutor's office, because I understand institutional pressure. I was not retained to harm anyone. But you made a call implying capacity to harm my wife. A pause. It was a negotiating posture. It was a mistake, Do-hyun said. Whatever you intended it to be, it was a mistake. Rio said nothing. Do-hyun stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Rio for a moment, at this 61-year-old professional ghost sitting in his book-lined apartment at 3 a.m. in his robe and no glasses, which made him look smaller than he was, and older, and more tired. Delete the documentation, Do-hyun said. Not for me. For yourself. Because if it exists and Kim Dae-jung's exposure becomes a problem, when, not if, you do not want to be the person who held that material. He paused. And tell Kim Dae-jung that the Western Corridor framework stands, and that the Changshin and Sindong parcels are going to remain complicated for anyone with his particular contracting history, because in the next 72 hours, I'm going to make a series of calls that will ensure his infrastructure contracts come under scrutiny that has nothing to do with territory and everything to do with the 6 years of political purchase his firm has been conducting in the Western districts. Rio looked at him. The former prosecutor in him was working, assessing the claim, assessing the capacity behind it, running the numbers on whether Do-hyun was capable of what he was describing. Do-hyun let him run the numbers. You'd escalate this, Rio said slowly, knowing what it would expose about your own. I have been running a criminal organization in this city for 15 years, Do-hyun said, with the flat patience of someone stating geography. Mr. Rio, I have exposure. I have been managing that exposure for 15 years. It is not new information to me. What is new information to me is that a 70-year-old construction magnate thought he could pressure me through my pregnant wife. He looked at Rio. He is wrong about my tolerance for that. He left. On the street outside, the cold hit him, and he walked half a block and stopped and put his hands on a wall and stayed there for a moment with his head down, just breathing. The anger had been running under the entire conversation like current under ice, controlled, purposeful, exactly placed. And now that he was out of the room, it moved up through his chest, and he stayed against the wall until it passed. It took about 45 seconds. He'd gotten faster at that over the years. He pulled out his phone. Not to call Zuri. It was past 3:30, and she needed sleep. He opened a separate application and began drafting the first of the communications he'd described to Rio, which were not a bluff. He had 3 legislators who owed him. He had a journalist, scrupulous, credible, the kind who checked everything twice, who had been trying to get a source close to the Western District contracting irregularities for 8 months. He had everything that journalists needed, clean enough to run, untraceable back to him. He worked until 5 a.m. standing on that street corner. At 5:15, he got back in his car and drove to Yongsan. He didn't go up. He parked and checked in with the man on the building entrance. Everything quiet, no approaches, both women inside the whole night. And then he sat in the car. At 5:50, he called Junho. Any movement on the Incheon side? Nothing since the summit. They signed the framework. They're not going to move against it openly. And Seo. Severance is processed. He cleared his desk at 8 p.m. No contact with Incheon or Choi since. Good. He rubbed his face with one hand. Stay on the building until I tell you otherwise. At 6 a.m. exactly, his phone rang. Zuri. He answered before the first ring finished. Tell me, she said. He told her. All of it. Ryo, Kim Dae-jung, the documentation, the conversation at 3 a.m., the communications he'd sent before dawn. She listened without interrupting, which was how she listened when it mattered. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Kim Dae-jung, she said. Yes. His Western District contracting. Is there a paper trail that goes through the prosecutor's office? He paused. Why? Because Ryo was prosecutor's office for 30 years. If Kim Dae-jung has been purchasing political cover in the Western districts, some of that purchase went through the prosecutor's office infrastructure, and Ryo didn't just know about it. He was probably part of it. Her voice had shifted into the particular register she used when she was building a legal architecture. Not excited, focused. The documentation Ryo is sitting on about your organization. What's its actual value to Kim Dae-jung if Ryo himself is implicated in the same contracting irregularities? Do-hyun sat forward. Mutually assured exposure. Which means Ryo-oh's real position is significantly weaker than he let on during your conversation. She paused. He's not holding your documentation for Kim Dae-jung. He's holding it for himself, as insurance, against Kim Dae-jung. The city was getting light outside the car windows. Do-hyun looked at the Yongsan building and the early gray sky above it and felt the specific sensation of a man who has been operating in partial darkness, suddenly getting the full picture, and the full picture being both worse and more manageable than the partial one. You should have been at that conversation, he said. I'm at it now. A pause, and then something moved in her voice. Not softness, exactly, but a slight change in the register. The lawyer receding just fractionally, and something more tired, more human, coming through. Are we safe? Yes. He said it without hesitation because he meant it. Ryo isn't operational. Kim Dae-jung doesn't want exposure. He wants a contract. Taking physical action against a pregnant woman isn't a calculated risk for a man in his position. It's a catastrophic one. The call was leverage theater. He paused. But I'm not pulling the perimeter until I've confirmed the documentation is gone. How? 48 hours. Maybe less. She absorbed that. Naomi's going to run out of clothes. I'll send someone. Do-hyun, don't send someone to Naomi's apartment at 6 in the morning to collect clothes. Just, and now she did make the sound that was almost a laugh, tired and wry and real. Tell me her building code and I'll call her landlord. He closed his eyes for a second. Just tell me the building code. Practical, direct, solving the actual problem instead of deploying a resource. 2 years of being married to a woman like this, and he'd spent them in offices. I'll text it to you, he said. Good. A pause. A longer one this time. He could hear her shifting, changing position probably. 8 months pregnant and sleeping on a couch in a safe house at 6 in the morning. Do-hyun. Yes. You came to me last night. Before you did anything, you called me and told me what was happening. Her voice was level but deliberate, choosing each word. I want you to know that I noticed that. It was what you asked for. It was what I asked for, she agreed. And you did it anyway, even though your instinct was probably to handle it and tell me after. A breath. I noticed. He didn't know what to say to that. He sat with it. Get some sleep, she said. You sound terrible. You said the same thing yesterday. It's still true. She hung up. He sat in the car outside her building while Seoul woke up around him. The first deliveries and the first workers, and the particular light of early morning that made the city look briefly like it was thinking about being gentle for once. He was exhausted. He hadn't slept in 30-something hours, and his body was registering that now that the operational pressure had dropped enough to let the signal through. He didn't sleep. He called the journalist at 6:45. The conversation took 12 minutes, and at the end of it, the journalist had everything she needed, and Do-hyun had a guarantee of publication within 36 hours. Not of anything traceable to him, but of enough to make Kim Dae-jung's Western District contracting history a matter of public record. Once it was public, the documentation Ryo was holding became a liability rather than an asset. Ryo would delete it. Not because Do-hyun had told him to, but because self-preservation was the one consistent principle in men like Ryo. At 8 a.m., Do-hyun's phone rang. An unknown number, different from Ryo's. He answered. The voice was older. accented with the particular cadence of a man from a certain generation of Korean business. Someone who had built things in the 70s and 80s when building required a specific kind of ruthlessness. Mr. Kang, I think we should meet. Kim Dae-jung himself. Do-hyun's pulse did not change. Not one beat. I don't think we have anything to meet about, he said. The framework stands. The parcels stay complicated, and by tomorrow morning the question of whether we have anything to discuss will be academic. A silence. Then, you are escalating this for territory you don't even need. I'm protecting what's mine, Do-hyun said. You can interpret that however you'd like. He hung up. At 9 a.m. he received a message from Rio's number. Not a call, a text. 3 words. It's been done. The documentation was gone. He forwarded the message to Junho with a note to have it verified through their technical contact, then set the phone down and pressed his head back against the car seat and looked at the ceiling of the vehicle. It was over. The operational piece was over. The Kim Dae-jung threat was neutralized, not eliminated. A man like that didn't eliminate cleanly, but reduced to the level of ordinary opposition that Do-hyun navigated every day. Incheon had signed the framework. SEO was gone. His mother had received a clear set of parameters. And Zuri was 4 floors above him in a building she hadn't chosen, sleeping badly, 8 months pregnant, having spent the night cataloging the dimensions of the danger that his life had brought to her door. That was the accounting. That was where things stood. He got out of the car. He stood on the pavement in the early morning cold and looked up at the building and thought about going up. Thought about knocking on the door at 9 a.m. after a night like this one and saying, "What, exactly? It's handled. You're safe now. I spent the night dismantling the threat, and I'm standing on your pavement because I don't know where else to go." He stood there for 2 minutes. Then he took out his phone and texted, "Documentation is confirmed gone. Journalist has what she needs. It publishes tomorrow. Kim Dae-jung won't move. You and Naomi are secure." He paused, then added, "I'm outside if you want to tell me to leave." He put the phone in his pocket and stood on the pavement. Upstairs, in the second bedroom of the Yongsan unit, Zuri read the message. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, already dressed, feet on the floor. The morning light came through the window and made everything look provisional. The temporary furniture, the unfamiliar walls, the coat she'd hung on the back of the door because there was no closet. She read the message twice. "I'm outside if you want to tell me to leave." She thought about the man in the car last night, on the pavement outside Naomi's building, who had called her before doing anything. She thought about the prenatal appointment and the one tear on his face in the low light. She thought about all the things that had been wrong for 2 years and about how the wrongness didn't disappear just because he was trying, because trying was the beginning of something, not the resolution of it. And she thought about her daughter, who had been moving steadily all night with the calm, purposeful momentum of something that didn't know yet what complications awaited her on the outside. She stood up. She went to this window. 4 floors down, on the pavement, Do-hyun was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets looking at his phone. He looked up, as if he felt her looking, the way he'd looked up outside Naomi's building days ago through 4 floors of Seoul air. This time, she didn't step back. She held up one hand. A gesture. Not a wave, not an invitation, just an acknowledgement. "I see you." He stood there looking up at her. He did not move. He just stood there, in the morning cold, looking up at the woman who was still, despite everything, the only person in his entire world who had never needed anything from him except for him to actually be there. And Kang Do-hyun, who had walked out of his mother's compound, neutralized a blackmail threat, and dismantled an 11 billion won power play in the space of 12 hours, stood on a Yongsan pavement and felt more uncertain than he had in any of those rooms. Because the operational battles were finished. What remained was harder. He was still standing there, looking up at the window, when Naomi appeared behind Zuri, visible for a moment before she registered what she was looking at, and stepped back and said something to Zuri that Do-hyun couldn't hear, and Zuri said something back, and then Zuri looked down at him again. She pressed her hand to the glass briefly, then let it drop. Then she turned from the window and moved back into the room, out of his line of sight. He stood there another moment. Then his phone buzzed. A text from an unsaved number. Naomi's, he realized, which meant Zuri had given it to her for exactly this kind of communication. It said, "She said you can come up, but you're buying breakfast." There's a place on the corner. He looked at the message. He looked at the building. He looked at the corner where a small restaurant was already open, the kind that existed in every Seoul neighborhood and opened at dawn and served exactly what people needed after a night that had cost them something. He walked to the corner. He ordered enough for 3, plus whatever was the closest thing they had to something warm and bland and gentle, which was what he remembered Zuri had wanted in her first trimester when everything else made her stomach uncertain. He didn't know if that was still true. He would find out. He was going to have to find out a lot of things. He carried the food back across the street and stood at the building entrance and looked up one more time, at the sky, which was the particular pale gray of a Seoul morning that hasn't decided yet what kind of day it's going to be. And then he went inside. The elevator was slow. He stood in it with the food and his exhaustion and the specific weight of a night that had taken everything he had, and he thought about what Zuri had said. "You came to me first." I noticed. The elevator stopped. The door opened. At the end of the hall, the apartment door was already open. He walked toward it, and the smell of coffee reached him through the gap. Naomi's coffee, strong and dark, and American, the way Zuri had learned to drink it, which was one of the 1,000 small things about her that had accumulated in him without his noticing until recently, when noticing was all he seemed to be able to do. He reached the door. He stopped in the doorway. Zuri was at the window, facing away from him, her hand on the glass where the morning light came through. She was still and enormous with their daughter, and her back was to him, and he stood there in the doorway with breakfast getting cold in his hands, and thought that he had never in his life been as sure of a single thing as he was in this moment of the exact nature of what he had almost lost. She turned. She looked at him for a long moment, at his face, which must have shown everything his 15 years of training had failed to suppress, because she was looking at him the way you look at something that has been injured and is trying not to show it. "You look worse than yesterday," she said. "I brought breakfast," he said. "I can see that." She didn't move toward him. She stayed at the window with the morning light behind her and looked at him with the particular steadiness of a woman who had decided, sometime in the last 12 hours, exactly how much rope she was willing to extend and was not going to extend more. "Sit down, Do-hyun, before you fall down." He sat down. Naomi appeared from the kitchen with cups and looked at him with the frank, assessing gaze of someone who had decided overnight to reserve judgment for a limited time based on limited evidence. She poured coffee without being asked. She sat across from him and looked at the food. "I hope you got the spicy one," she said. "Because this one," she nodded toward Zuri, "has been craving it for 3 days and hasn't said anything because she's polite to a fault." "Naomi," Zuri said, "I'm just saying." Do-hyun looked through the bags. He pulled out the container that was, in fact, the spicier of the two options, because he'd gotten both without fully knowing why, and set it in front of Zuri. She looked at it, then at him. "Lucky guess," she said. "I've been paying attention," he said. "I know it's late, but I have been." The morning settled around them. The 3 of them in a temporary apartment in a building she hadn't chosen, eating food from a corner restaurant, the city going about its ordinary business outside the window. It was not a resolution. It was not a moment where things became simple or healed or made right. It was breakfast at 9 a.m. after the worst 12 hours of Do-hyun's adult life, with a woman who was not ready to come home, and a friend who was withholding judgment, and a daughter who was moving steadily, purposefully, inside her mother, preparing for a world that was going to be complicated. Do-hyun ate. He drank the coffee. He answered Zuri's questions about Kim Dae-jung with the precision she required and Naomi's questions about what came next with the honesty he was learning to substitute for strategy. And when Zuri, sometime after the food was gone, shifted in her chair and put one hand on the side of her stomach and made a small, involuntary sound, he was out of his chair before he'd consciously decided to move. "Are you—" "I'm fine," she said. "She's just—" And then she stopped, and her face changed, and he went very still. "Zuri." Her eyes met his. Something new was in them. Not pain exactly, but the specific alertness of a body that has received a signal. "How far apart?" he said. His voice was completely level in the way that only happened when the thing he was managing was too important to allow any other register. She breathed. "I don't know, this might be the second one." Naomi was already on her feet. "I'll get your bag." "I packed it last week," Zuri said to Do-hyun, and something about the way she said it, with the calm, practical precision of a woman who had prepared alone for this moment because she hadn't known whether she'd be going through it alone, hit him somewhere physical. "I'm taking you," he said. "I know," she said. And she let him help her up, which meant something, her hand in his and her weight briefly against him, and he held her arm and she let him, and that small permission was the most significant thing that had happened in the last 12 hours. "Call Dr. Yoon," she said. "The number's in my phone." "I have it," he said. And he did. He'd memorized it the night of the prenatal appointment, standing outside the clinic, because memorizing the contact information of everyone responsible for his wife's health had seemed like the bare minimum of what he could do. Naomi came back with a bag. She handed it to Do-hyun. She looked at Zuri. "Go," Naomi said. "I'll follow." Do-hyun held Zuri's bag in one hand and her arm in the other, and they walked to the elevator, and he pressed the button, and they waited, side by side. And the elevator was slow again, and in the silence Zuri exhaled, slowly and deliberately, the way someone breathes through something that requires management. He watched her and said nothing. She didn't need him to say anything. She needed him to be there, in the precise and uncomplicated sense of the word. Present, functional, hands available. The elevator opened. They stepped in. The door closed. In the mirror on the back wall of the elevator, he could see them both, her face, set and focused and not quite afraid, and his face, which he couldn't read at all because he'd been looking at it too long, and their reflection together, side by side, her hand in his. He tightened his grip on her hand slightly, and she squeezed back, and the elevator descended toward the lobby where the car was waiting and the city was going on, and everything that had been coming toward them for 8 months was finally, irrevocably, here. The contractions were 7 minutes apart by the time Do-hyun got the car out of the Yongsan building's parking structure. He knew because he was counting. Not with a timer. He hadn't thought to start one until they were already moving, but by the quality of Zuri's breathing in the passenger seat beside him, which changed at intervals that his body was tracking with the involuntary precision of someone who had been paying attention to her for the past several weeks in a way he hadn't in the 2 years before that. She was breathing through it. Each contraction arrived like a wave she'd decided to ride rather than fight. Long exhale through the nose, jaw loose, eyes forward. She'd clearly read the materials. She'd prepared. She'd done all of it without asking him to do it with her, because she hadn't known if he'd be there when it mattered. He was there. He kept his hand on the wheel and drove with the particular focused calm he brought to situations that required everything he had. Seoul's morning traffic was already building. He took 2 turns that weren't the direct route but were faster, which he knew because he'd driven this city for 15 years in circumstances that required knowing the faster routes. "Dr. Yoon is meeting us there," he said. "I know. I heard you call her." A breath. "Don't run the lights." "I'm not running the lights." "You were about to." He eased off the accelerator slightly. "Better." "Much." She pressed her back against the seat and exhaled. The contraction passed. She came back from it the way she came back from everything, fully, immediately, without residue. "How far?" 8 minutes. She nodded, looked out the window. He could see her profile in the morning light, the set of her jaw, the particular stillness of her hands on her thighs, the way her attention moved between the external world and whatever internal monitoring she was doing. She looked like a woman managing a situation. She also looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the labor and everything to do with the 8 months that had preceded it. "Hey," he said. She turned her head. "I've got you," he said. Not "it's going to be fine," not "don't worry," just that. A statement of position. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said, and turned back to the window. He drove. The hospital was a private facility in Gangnam that Dr. Yoon was affiliated with, the kind of place that was efficient and quiet and moved people through its systems with the smooth professionalism of significant funding. Do-hyun pulled up to the entrance and was out of the car before it had fully stopped, which was not technically possible but happened anyway. And he came around and opened the passenger door and gave Zuri his hand, and she took it and got out, and another contraction hit her on the pavement right there at the entrance, and she gripped his hand and breathed through it while a nurse appeared with a wheelchair, and Do-hyun said quietly and with absolute clarity, "She needs to walk in. Give her a moment." The nurse gave her a moment. Zuri straightened. She looked at the nurse. "I'll take the chair now," she said. And she sat. They moved her through intake with the speed that came from Dr. Yoon having called ahead. Do-hyun followed through every corridor, answered the administrative questions that Zuri waved off because she was focused on other things, signed what needed signing, and stayed out of the way of every medical professional who needed to be in the room while never once leaving the room. Naomi arrived 22 minutes later. She appeared in the doorway of the labor room, slightly out of breath from whatever taxi she'd taken, and looked at Zuri in the bed and then at Do-hyun in the chair beside her. "How far apart?" Naomi said. 5 minutes, Zuri said. "Good." Naomi came in and took up a position on Zuri's other side. She looked at Do-hyun across the bed. A long look. The look of a woman who had spent 8 months watching her best friend get hurt and had spent the last 12 hours revising her assessment of the man responsible. She did not say anything, but she didn't ask him to leave. That was enough. The labor was 11 hours. 11 hours during which the world outside the hospital room continued its ordinary operations. The Western Corridor Framework was filed with the relevant administrative bodies and became legally binding. The journalist's article went to final edit, scheduled for morning publication. Kim Dae-jung's legal team made 2 calls to Do-hyun's operational line, which Junho handled with the information that Mr. Kong was unavailable and would be for the foreseeable future. The Incheon group sent a formal acknowledgement of the framework. Seo Kyung-soo moved out of his apartment and relocated to a city 3 hours south, which Junho noted and reported, and Do-hyun read between contractions and filed away. All of it happened. Do-hyun received the reports and responded in the intervals when Zuri didn't need him. He kept his phone on silent and face down when she did, which was most of the time. At hour 4, Zuri asked him to stand where she could see his face during contractions, not hold her hand. She'd decided she didn't want her hand held. She wanted both her hands free, just be visible. In her line of sight, a fixed point. He stood where she told him to stand. At hour 7, she said without context, "Tell me something." He'd been awake for nearly 30 hours. His suit was a catastrophe. He'd taken off his jacket at hour 2 and his tie at hour 3, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and he was the least composed he had been in any room in 15 years. "What do you want me to tell you?" "Anything. Talk. I need to hear something that isn't medical." He thought for a moment. Then he told her about the building in Yongsan. Not the operational facts of it, but how he'd acquired it, which was a story about a previous owner who had been a sculptor and had installed a kiln on the 3rd floor that was still technically there because removing it would have required dismantling part of the structural wall. He'd never had it removed. He'd bought the building for a specific purpose, and the kiln had always been an inconvenience he meant to address, and never did. She listened. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was managed. "What kind of sculptures?" she said. "I don't know. I never asked." "You bought a building and never found out what the person who lived there made." "I had this building swept for security concerns, not for information about a person." She breathed through the end of a contraction. "That's such a you thing." "I know," he said. "I'm working on that." "The kiln is still there." "Yes." Don't remove it," she said. "It's the most interesting thing about the building." He looked at her. "Okay." "I mean it. If you remove it, I will be—" And then the next contraction came and she stopped talking and managed it. And when it passed, she exhaled and said, deeply unimpressed. "The kiln stays," he said. Naomi, who had been sitting in the corner eating a hospital vending machine sandwich with the focused efficiency of someone maintaining caloric intake for a long operation, said, without looking up, "You two are very weird." Neither of them disagreed. At hour 11, their daughter arrived. She was small and furious and announced herself with a sound that was not the tentative cry of something uncertain about the world, but the specific, indignant volume of someone who had decided, in the first seconds of existence, that she had opinions and intended to express them. Dr. Yoon said the appropriate things. The nurses did the appropriate things. Zuri made a sound that Do-hyun would carry for the rest of his life without ever being able to describe it. Not pain, not relief, not joy exactly, but something that contained all of those and also something beyond them. He was not in the delivery position. He was where he'd been told to stand, which was where Zuri could see his face, which meant he saw her face at the moment their daughter arrived in the world. He saw exactly what it looked like. He would not try to describe it. Some things didn't need to be filed. They wrapped the baby and brought her to Zuri's chest, and the room got very quiet. Do-hyun stood at his fixed point and watched Zuri look at their daughter for the first time, and the only word his overtaxed brain could produce was careful. She held her with such specific care, both hands, completely oriented toward this new, small human, as if everything else in the room had simply stopped existing. "Hi," Zuri said, quietly, to the baby. Just that. "Hi." The baby blinked. Her face cycled through approximately 6 expressions in 4 seconds. Furious, confused, considering, furious again, and then something that settled towards something softer. Zuri looked up at Do-hyun. He didn't know what his face was doing. He'd stopped knowing an hour ago. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed where there was room and looked at his daughter from a distance of approximately 18 inches. And she was the smallest human being he had ever been in close proximity to, and she had black hair, and her eyes, when she opened them, were the dark, unfocused eyes of something brand new, looking at the world without any preconceptions about what it was supposed to be. "Do you want to hold her?" Zuri said. He did. He was also, for the first time in 15 years, genuinely afraid of doing something wrong. "Yes," he said. Zuri passed her across with the economy of motion of someone who had already learned the transfer in the last 5 minutes, which was characteristic. He took his daughter in both hands and held her the way Zuri had shown him, instinctively, without instruction, supporting the head close to his chest, and he looked down at her face and she looked up, or in his approximate direction, with those dark, unfocused eyes. The heartbeat he'd heard on the ultrasound was here now, in his hands, the size of it, the weight. Approximately 7 pounds of person who had not existed in the world 12 minutes ago and now simply did, and her existence was complete and irrevocable and required nothing from him except to be there. He was there. 1 tear. Not because he chose it chose itself, the way the one in the ultrasound room had, and he didn't wipe it, he just let it happen. "Nia," Zuri said. He looked up. "I'd like her name to be Nia," she said, "if you agree." "What does it mean?" he said, though he mostly asked because he wanted to hear her say it. "It means purpose." She watched his face. "Nia Kang." He looked at his daughter. "Nia," he said, and his voice did something at the end of the word that he didn't try to control. The baby made a small sound that was not quite a protest and not quite agreement. She moved her head against his chest with the purposeful, instinctive motion of something looking for warmth. "Nia," he said again. Naomi from the corner was crying without any apparent intention of stopping or acknowledging it. When Zuri looked at her, she said, I'm fine, it's just, she's very small." And Zuri said, "She really is." And that was the whole conversation. The hours after were the particular blur of the immediate post-arrival. Medical things, administrative things, the baby being assessed and swaddled and returned, Zuri being attended to, the room being rearranged into the hospital room configuration that would hold them for the next day. Naomi left at some point to find real food and make calls. Dr. Yoon came by once more and said what she needed to say and left. And then it was just the 2 of them, and Nia sleeping in the hospital bassinet between them, and the afternoon light coming through the window at an angle that made everything look quieter than it was. Do-hyun was in the chair. He hadn't been back to his car, or to any other location, in 17 hours. He had no jacket. His shirt was rolled to the elbows. He looked, by any objective measure, like a man who had been through something significant and was still inside it. Zuri was watching him. "Sleep," she said. "I'm fine." "You said that 3 hours ago." "It was true then, too." She looked at him with the particular expression she used when she had decided not to argue, because the argument would take energy she'd allocated elsewhere. "There's a cot they'll bring in. Ask the nurse." "In a minute." She was quiet for a moment. The baby made a small sound and then was quiet again. Outside the window, Seoul did what it always did. "Do-hyun," she said. "Yes." "I need to say something." She adjusted her position against the pillows with the careful, deliberate movement of someone whose body had just done something enormous and was being respected accordingly. "Not now. I don't have the right words yet, but soon. There are things I need to say that I've been holding because every time I was close to saying them, something else happened, and I'm not going to hold them anymore." "Okay," he said. "That's not an invitation to tell me you already know what they are." "I wasn't going to." You were thinking about it. He almost smiled. Almost. Maybe. She looked at their daughter for a moment, the baby's chest rising and falling with the absolute commitment of something that has no doubts about the value of its own existence. You did something different, Zuri said, over these last weeks. I watched you do it. She kept her eyes on Nia. I know it doesn't erase the years before it. I'm not saying it does. But I watched you change, and I want you to know that I saw it. Because you did it without asking me to notice, and you did it when there was nothing guaranteed on the other end of it. And that's different from apology. That's different from strategy. He sat with that. The night you called me, she said, before you did anything about the threat, that was the first time in a long time that I felt like I was a partner in my own life. She finally looked at him. That's all I wanted. That's all I ever wanted. To be in it with you, not behind the glass watching you manage everything. I know, he said. Do you? Not an accusation, a genuine question. I'm learning, he said. I know the difference between knowing and doing. I've been better at knowing. He leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees. I can't undo what the last 2 years looked like. I've thought about it, and I can't find the mechanism for that, and I'm not going to pretend there is one. But I know what I was doing. I was running the empire and leaving the marriage to sustain itself on history and assumption, on the fact that it had been good, and so I assumed it would stay good without maintenance. He looked at his hands. That's how I managed the marriage, like an asset that appreciated on its own. She was very still. You are not an asset, he said. You're the person who walked into my conference room and told me everything my team was doing wrong, and who learned to love a city she wasn't from, and who spent 2 years being systematically diminished in my own family's house, and never once asked me to fight a battle she thought she could manage herself. He raised his eyes. And I let you manage it, and you shouldn't have had to. The room was quiet. Nia made another small sound and settled. No, Zuri said, after a long moment. I shouldn't have. I'm going to be different, he said. Not better at promising. Different. I know. She inhaled slowly. I'm not ready to come home yet. I want you to know that hasn't changed. I need more time in a space that's mine where I can, she searched, where I can hear myself think without the weight of everything the penthouse carries. I need that. Okay, he said. Not how long, not what would change that, just okay. She looked at him steadily, measuring. You're not going to negotiate that. No. You want to. Yes, he said. I always want to negotiate. It's how I'm made. I'm choosing not to. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the territory of recognition. Good, she said. He reached into his jacket, which was on the back of the chair. He found what he'd been carrying for weeks. He held it in his palm and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Zuri. The wedding ring caught the afternoon light. She looked at it. Her expression was complicated. Not closed, not open, but layered, the way her expressions were when she was experiencing more than one thing simultaneously. I'm not giving it back to you right now, he said. I'm not asking you to put it back on. He stopped. The words he'd prepared for this, which he'd had several iterations of, had not accounted for 30 hours without sleep and a daughter and the specific quality of afternoon light. I've been carrying it. I wanted you to know I've been carrying it, because I know what it meant that you left it. And I know that putting it back has to mean something, or it means nothing, and I don't want it to mean nothing. She looked at the ring. He held it. He didn't extend it. He just held it in his open palm between them. Keep it, she said. He closed his fingers around it. For now. For now, she agreed. Naomi came back with food from a restaurant 3 blocks away. Actual food, containers of it, enough for 3 people, which she distributed with the practical efficiency of someone who had decided that feeding people was the correct response to nearly every situation. She looked at Do-hyun, and then at Zuri, and then at the space between them, which had a different quality than when she'd left, and she said nothing about it. She sat and opened her container, and they all ate. At some point, while they were eating, Nia woke up. She didn't cry. She made the pre-cry sound, the escalating series of complaints that preceded full commitment to the project of crying. And Zuri set down her food and reached for her, and Do-hyun was already standing, and Naomi said, I've got it, sit down. and reached Nia first and lifted her with the practiced ease of someone who had clearly held infants before and walked the room with her, and Nia's pre-cry escalated, and then, with the logic available only to newborns, entirely stopped. Naomi looked down at the baby. "She's fine," she said. "She just wanted someone to pick her up." A pause. "I respect that." Zuri laughed. A real one, unguarded, the first Do-hyun had heard from her in months. Not the almost laugh, not the suppressed one, but an actual laugh that caught her slightly off guard as it came out. She pressed one hand to her side and said, "Don't make me laugh, it hurts." And Naomi said, "Then stop finding me funny." And Zuri laughed again and said something unprintable, and Naomi said it back, and Do-hyun sat in his chair watching this exchange with an expression on his face that he wasn't managing at all. He was glad. He was so specifically glad that she had Naomi. That she had walked out of his house at 5 a.m. with 2 bags and called the person who would open the door without questions. That the person existed. He was going to say that to Naomi, at some point, in whatever words she'd accept. That she had taken care of what he'd failed to take care of, and he didn't have a framework for what that cost her, or what it meant. But he was not going to be the kind of man who let it go unacknowledged. Not anymore. Nia was returned to the bassinet. The food was finished. The light through the window had moved into the gold register of late afternoon. Do-hyun finally asked for the cot, which a nurse brought and set up in the corner, and he lay down on it in his shirt and trousers and was unconscious within approximately 4 minutes. He slept for 6 hours. When he woke, the room was dim, and Naomi was asleep in the reclining chair they'd brought in, head at an angle that was going to give her a neck problem, and Zuri was awake in the bed, feeding Nia in the low light, and the room was so quiet that Do-hyun lay still for a moment, not wanting to disrupt it. Zuri looked up. She saw him watching. "Good morning," she said. "It wasn't morning. It was close to 2 a.m. How long was I out?" 6 hours. You needed it." He sat up. His body protested in 3 specific locations. He ignored all of them. "You should have woken me." "You needed sleep more than you needed to watch me feed the baby." She looked down at Nia. "She's eating well. Dr. Yoon said so." "Good." He ran a hand through his hair. He looked at the 2 of them in the low light, his wife and his daughter, and thought that he was not a man who used the word grateful easily, who didn't carry it as a daily currency, and that he was going to have to develop a working relationship with it, because the alternative was continuing to walk through his life taking the most significant things in it for granted, which he had done and which had cost him, and he was finished with the cost. "What are you thinking?" Zuri said. "That I want to do better," he said, "every day, specific days, not as an abstract principle." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay. Not just the big things, the small ones. Coming home when I say I'm coming home. Being in the room when the room is where I should be." He looked at Nia. "Knowing what she's craving without being told." Zuri followed his gaze. "She's 3 hours old. Her cravings are fairly straightforward right now." "For now," he said. She almost smiled. Did smile this time. Small and real and belonging specifically to the current moment. "For now," she agreed. They sat in that quiet for a while, the 3 of them plus Naomi's soft snoring from the recliner, which was the most comfortable sound in the room because it meant someone entirely outside their marriage had decided, through action, that they were worth staying for. 3 weeks later, the journalist's article ran. It landed on a Tuesday morning, and by afternoon it was the 3rd most read piece on the publication's website. Kim Dae-jung's construction firm's Western District contracting history was laid out in the methodical, documented way that journalists with good sources and better editors produced. Not sensational, not accusatory beyond what the evidence supported, but thorough. The kind of piece that opened questions rather than answered them, which was considerably more dangerous to its subject than a piece that closed anything. Kim Dae-jung's legal team issued a statement. The statement was the legal equivalent of a man trying to look relaxed while his collar was on fire. 2 of the government contracting board members mentioned in the article requested emergency legal consultations. One of the Western District legislators, whose name appeared in a footnote, went on sudden medical leave. Ryo Sang-il made no statement. He had, as far as Do-hyun's contacts could determine, quietly departed Seoul for a property he owned in the South Coast, which was the sensible choice of a man who understood that he had been standing between two parties with significant resources and had chosen to step entirely out of the way. The Western Corridor framework was not touched. Do-hyun read the article at his desk and then set his phone face down and went back to the document he'd been working on, which was a restructuring plan for the organization's legitimate business holdings, a project he'd been putting off for 2 years because it required a kind of sustained attention that he'd been directing elsewhere. He was directing it here now. He was directing it here because it was the work that would, over time, create the conditions for a different kind of life. One where the infrastructure of violence was not the first tool available because other tools had been built. It was slow work. It would take years. He was not impatient about it, which was itself a change. Zuri had moved from the Yongsan unit to an apartment in Mapo-gu, not Naomi's building, but close to it, a 2-bedroom in a quieter part of the neighborhood that she'd found herself and signed herself and furnished in the spare, practical way she furnished things. He had not offered to pay for it. She had not asked. They'd had one conversation about finances that was straightforward and adult and arrived at a clear arrangement, which was that she would tell him what she needed, and he would provide it without attaching conditions to the provision. He visited twice a week, always when invited, always on time. He brought food sometimes, from the restaurant near the Yongsan unit, because that had become a small shared reference point, one of the first ones they'd built in the new configuration of their relationship. He sat on the floor with Nia on a blanket between them and watched his daughter discover her own hands with the focused astonishment of someone encountering a profound mystery, and he talked to Zuri about the restructuring, and she talked to him about the international arbitration case she'd gone back to from home, working 3 hours a day between feeds, because the work was hers, and she hadn't stopped being good at it just because her life had complicated. She was extraordinary. He'd known it from the first meeting. He'd gotten accustomed to it the way you get accustomed to extraordinary things when they're present every day, which was to say, he'd stopped seeing it. He was seeing it again now. On a Saturday afternoon, 6 weeks after Nia was born, he arrived with food, and she opened the door, and Nia was asleep in the carrier against her chest. And Zuri looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite categorize, and then she said, "Come in," and stepped back, and he came in, and she said, "I want to talk about coming home." He set the food down carefully. "Not yet," she said. "I'm not saying yet. I'm saying I want to talk about what it would look like. What would need to be different about the penthouse? Not the physical things, but the architecture of how it operates. Who has access? What the family dynamic looks like now." She sat on the couch and adjusted the carrier and looked at him. "I want to have that conversation." "Okay," he said. He sat across from her. "Where do you want to start?" "Your mother," she said. He'd known that was where it would start. "Yes." "Tell me what happened, the whole conversation, what she said and what you said and what changed." He told her. He told her pieces of it in the weeks since, but not the whole thing in sequence. He told it now. The sitting room, the chrysanthemums, the tea she'd poured that he hadn't drunk, the words he'd used and the ones he'd chosen not to use, and the moment when he'd told her that Zuri's name was Zuri and that anyone who didn't use it would lose access to him. Zuri listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "She called me last week," she said. He went very still. "I know you told her not to. She did anyway." Zuri's voice was level, reporting a fact. "She called on a Wednesday afternoon. I almost didn't answer." A pause. "She didn't apologize. I want you to know that she didn't call to apologize. She called to tell me that she had spoken to a specialist in African cultural heritage." She held his gaze. "Because she wanted to learn more about where I came from." The room was quiet. "She didn't say it right," Zuri said. She made it weird and formal, and there was a very Madame Kong quality to the whole thing where it was clear she felt she was doing me a significant honor. It was not a comfortable conversation. A breath. But she made the call. He didn't know what to do with this information, and he sat with that. "I'm not forgiving her," Zuri said. "I want to be clear. What she did over 2 years was not corrected by one phone call. But I've been thinking about what it means to raise Nia in a family that is actively broken, and what it costs a child to grow up in the wreckage of things that adults couldn't manage to repair." She looked down at the sleeping baby against her chest. "I'm not going to pretend things are fine when they aren't, but I'm willing to move toward something, slowly." She didn't tell me she called you, he said. I know. I'm telling you. She looked at him. Because we're in this together. That's what you said. Not with those words, but that's what the last 6 weeks have been. You show up when you say you will, and you tell me things when they happen, and you eat on the floor. She almost smiled. You eat on the floor a lot now. Nia is more interesting on the floor. She really is. The almost smile became a real one. She was quiet for a moment, looking at their daughter. I want to come home in spring, she said, after the renovation. What renovation? The penthouse needs to be different, she said. Not gutted, but different. There's a room on the east side that doesn't get used. I want it to be Nia's room, and I want to be involved in how it's set up, and I want the place to feel like somewhere I actually live rather than somewhere I was housed. She met his eyes. I want a studio. Somewhere I can work from home with a door that closes and my own things in it. Done, he said. I haven't told you the size. Whatever size you want. That's not a negotiation. It's your home. She looked at him for a moment. The assessing look, the one he'd learned to sit inside rather than try to satisfy. You mean that? I do. She exhaled. Okay. He reached into his jacket. He held out the ring. She looked at it for a long moment. He watched her look at it. The way her eyes moved over it, the small, involuntary shift in her expression that was not quite the expression she wore for difficult decisions, but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone weighing something real. She reached out. She took it from his palm and held it between 2 fingers and turned it once, the way she might turn a piece of evidence to examine it from both sides. Then she looked at him. I'm not putting it on today, she said. Okay. I'm keeping it, though. Good. She closed her fingers around it and held it loosely in her hand, not wearing it but holding it, which was its own kind of statement about the distance between where they were and where they were going. Not far, not impossible, but real, with texture and difficulty and the specific effort of 2 people choosing the same direction without pretending the choosing was easy. Nia made a sound in the carrier, a small, exploratory sound, not a complaint but an announcement. Her eyes opened, the dark, still unfocused eyes of a 6-week-old, looking at the light coming through the window with the open-ended attention of someone for whom everything was still new information. Do-hyun watched her. She has your nose, Zuri said. She has your forehead. She has a very strong opinion about being awake, Zuri said. That's pure Kong. He looked at Zuri. Thank you. For which part? All of it, he said. For not making it easy on me. For not letting me solve my way back in. For making me earn it the right way. She looked at him steadily. You're not done earning it. I know. I'm not asking for the account to be settled. I'm just... He stopped. Thank you for staying in the negotiation. I'm a very good negotiator, she said. You hired me yourself. I know, he said. Best decision I ever made. She looked at him. Then she adjusted the carrier strap and stood, moving toward the window with Nia, and said, The food's getting cold. He got up and followed. They ate on the floor because that had become the place where things felt most like what they actually were. 2 people without the furniture of their old arrangements around them, just the food and the baby and the afternoon coming through the window and the particular quality of a conversation that had been going on for weeks and still had things left to say. On a Tuesday in late March, Zuri came home. She came with 3 boxes, which was all she'd taken when she'd gone, because she hadn't had time for more than 2 bags the night she left, and had accumulated exactly 1 box worth of additional things in the months since. Naomi drove 1 box. Do-hyun carried 2. Naomi stayed for an hour and walked the renovated penthouse with the critical attention of an inspector, noted that the studio was actually good, noted that Nia's room got more light than her own apartment, said not bad to Do-hyun directly, which was the highest and most specific compliment she'd yet offered him, and left. Zuri stood in the penthouse, in her coat, Nia in the carrier, and looked around at the space that was and was not the same as the one she'd left. The furniture was mostly the same. But the studio existed now, behind a door that closed, with her books and her files and the small framed photograph of her parents that had been on every nightstand she'd owned since she was 22. Nia's room was on the east side, with the light and the colors Zuri had chosen. The space breathed differently, less like a showroom, more like somewhere people lived. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. It's good, she said. It's actually good, he exhaled. He hadn't known he was holding it. She walked to the window, the one that looked east, over the city they'd both chosen, this city that had somehow contained all of it, and stood there with their daughter against her chest, and looked out at Seoul doing what it always did, bright and indifferent and magnificent. And after a moment, Do-hyun came and stood beside her, not touching, just there. Outside, the spring had arrived the way spring arrived in Seoul. Suddenly and without ceremony, the cherry blossoms appearing almost overnight in the parks below, the light changing its quality in a way that was physical, something you could feel against your skin. The city looked like itself, but lighter. What happens now? Zuri said, not anxious, just asking. We figure it out, he said. One day. I come home when I say I will. I tell you when something is happening instead of after. I eat on the floor. He paused. We raise her. She looked down at Nia, who was looking at the window with the absolute attention of a 3-month-old encountering reflected light for the first time. Her hands were opening and closing, reaching for something she couldn't quite locate, trying to get hold of the brightness. She's going to be so much trouble, Zuri said. The way she said it was not a complaint. I know, Do-hyun said. She has your persistence. Zuri looked at him sideways. She has your stubbornness. Those are the same thing. They are very much not the same thing. He didn't argue. He looked at their daughter's reaching hands, the light she was trying to grab, and thought that there was a version of his life where he had missed this, where the empire and the distance and his own particular blindness had accumulated until what remained was a ring on a nightstand and a woman who had run out of ways to be seen. He'd been very close to that version. He'd sat on the edge of that empty bed and understood, finally, what he was at risk of losing. He hadn't lost it. Not because he deserved not to. He was clear-eyed enough to know that. He hadn't lost it because Zuri was the person she was, because she'd had the precision to know what she needed and the courage to go get it rather than waiting to be given it. Because she'd stayed in the negotiation, as she'd called it, not for him, not out of obligation, but because she'd looked at what he was doing differently and decided it was real. He owed her that assessment. He intended to spend the rest of his life being worth it. He reached over, not for her hand, she was holding Nia, but for the small space beside her hand on the window frame, and he set his own hand there. Close. Present. Not demanding anything. After a moment, her hand shifted slightly. One finger rested against his. That was all. It was enough. Outside, the city went on. The blossoms held in the trees below. Nia made a sound of concentrated effort toward the light she was trying to catch, her small fingers opening and closing, completely absorbed in the work of reaching for something just at the edge of her grasp. She was new to all of it. She didn't know yet that the world was difficult. She didn't know yet that the people who loved you sometimes failed you, that love by itself was not a structure but required daily construction, that presence was a practice rather than a given. She would learn those things, the way everyone learned them. But she would learn them in a home where two people had looked at the damage they'd each done and were choosing, every ordinary day, to repair it. That was what Zuri had walked back into. That was what Do-hyun had spent 6 months becoming able to offer. Not a perfect man, not an uncomplicated life, not a marriage that hadn't been broken. A broken thing repaired, which is different from a thing that was never broken, more visible at the seams, more considered in its construction, held together by the specific decision to hold it rather than by the original faith that it would hold itself. Zuri looked out the window at the city she'd chosen when she was 29 and had been choosing in various ways every day since. She could feel the ring in her coat pocket. She'd put it there this morning before leaving the Mapogu apartment for the last time. Not on her finger. In her pocket. Close. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe next week. Maybe on a day when neither of them was marking the occasion and the ring slid back onto her finger because it was simply where it belonged and the moment didn't require ceremony. Maybe that. She'd know when she knew. Until then, one finger against his on the window frame, their daughter reaching for light, the city going on below. This was the shape of the thing. Imperfect, effortful, real. It was enough to build from. It was more than enough.